At 29 years old, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. When I called my parents in tears, my mother simply sighed and told me she could not deal with my drama because my sister's destination wedding was only 3 weeks away. I fought through chemotherapy completely alone. I recovered, rebuilt my life, and 3 years later, my sister called me begging for money to save her from financial ruin. My 5-word response left her in dead silence. My name is Hazel, and I am 32 years old. Before I share how I survived the ultimate family betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members always get what they deserve. 3 years ago, I stood in the sterile, echoing hallway of the Riverside Oncology Clinic in Chicago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly greenish glow against the linoleum floor. I was clutching a thick manila folder filled with terrifying pamphlets about survival rates, treatment plans, and side effects. Stage 3. The doctor had said the words gently, but they hit me like a runaway freight train. My vision blurred. My hands shook so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I needed my mother. I had spent my entire youth trying to earn Beverly's approval. I was the quiet, responsible daughter who stayed out of trouble while Felicity threw tantrums and demanded expensive gifts. I thought surely a cancer diagnosis would finally make my mother see me, value me, and care about my existence. My instinct was to seek maternal comfort. I hit dial and waited. Beverly picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice immediately carried the frantic, annoyed pitch she reserved for minor inconveniences like terrible traffic or a wrong coffee order. Hazel, I absolutely cannot deal with whatever drama you have right now. Felicity's videographer just canceled, and the destination wedding is in 3 weeks. I am up to my neck in deposits and floral arrangements. I stood frozen, leaning my back against the cold hospital wall, trying to process her complete lack of warmth. Mom. I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. I am at the hospital. I just got my test results back. It is cancer. Stage 3. There was a heavy pause on the line. For a fraction of a second, I thought she might drop the phone, rush to her car, and drive to the clinic to hold me. Instead, she let out a sharp, exasperated sigh that echoed in my ear. Are you serious right now? Hazel, the timing could not possibly be worse. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was not expressing shock at the diagnosis. She was expressing pure frustration at the inconvenience of my illness. The doctor says I need to start chemotherapy immediately, I told her, trying to force the stark reality of the situation into her brain. Chemo, Beverly shrieked. But what about the bridal party photos? We are flying to the Bahamas in less than a month. If you are doing chemo, your hair is going to fall out. You are going to look pale and sickly. Felicity has a very specific aesthetic planned for the beach ceremony. You are going to completely ruin the pictures. I closed my eyes as the cruel words registered. My life was falling apart. I was facing my mortality before I turned 30, and my own mother was solely worried about the color palette of my sister's wedding photos. I hung up the phone without another word. I walked out of the clinic and drove myself back to my small apartment, realizing that if I was going to fight this horrible disease, I would have to do it entirely without a family. 2 days later, I was sitting on my worn sofa, organizing my medical bills, and trying to figure out how I would pay for my crushing deductibles. I worked as a freelance video editor. It was a career I loved, but it meant I paid for my own expensive health insurance. Felicity was given everything she demanded: private tutors, designer clothes, a brand new car for her 16th birthday. Over the years, I had painstakingly saved $15,000 in an emergency fund from my hard work. It was my absolute lifeline. A loud knock startled me. Beverly and Felicity let themselves in using the spare key I had given them for emergencies. They did not bring soup. They did not bring hugs or words of encouragement. Hazel, we need to talk, Beverly announced, standing in the center of my living room, with her arms tightly crossed. The wedding budget has completely ballooned, and since the videographer canceled, we have to hire a premium media team from Miami. They require a $15,000 deposit up front by tomorrow. I stared at them, my mind struggling to process their sheer audacity. I am starting chemotherapy tomorrow morning, I said quietly. I have cancer. Do you understand what that means? Felicity rolled her eyes, adjusting the thick leather strap of her designer handbag. Yes, Hazel, we know. You are sick. But you are going to be stuck in a hospital bed anyway. You are not going to be traveling. You are not going to be going out. So you do not need the money you have saved up. My wedding needs a new media team, and your little video editing hobby has finally paid off. Give us the emergency fund. I felt a cold, hard knot form deep in my stomach. You want me to give you the money I need to survive so you can have better wedding videos. It is a loan. Beverly snapped, her face twisting with impatience. Your sister is marrying Greg. He is a successful tech founder. He will pay you back eventually. But right now, family needs to support family. You have always been so selfish with your money. Family supports family. I repeated, the bitter irony burning my throat. You told me 2 days ago that my cancer was going to ruin your photos. You did not ask how I was feeling. Neither of you have asked what my prognosis is or if I am scared. I stood up, my legs trembling, but my voice completely steady. Get out, both of you. Beverly gasped, clutching her chest in mock horror. Excuse me. I said, get out of my apartment, I yelled, pointing directly to the open door. I am not giving you a single dime. This is my money for my medical care. You can film your own wedding on your phones for all I care. Felicity scowled, her face turning an ugly shade of red. You are always playing the victim. Enjoy being miserable and alone. They stormed out, slamming the door so hard the framed photos on my wall rattled violently. I locked the deadbolt, slid down to the hardwood floor, and cried until I had nothing left inside me. The next morning, I arrived at the oncology center for my first infusion. The treatment room was freezing, filled with the mechanical hum of machines and the quiet, fearful murmurs of other patients fighting their own desperate battles. The nurse hooked up my port, and the toxic life-saving chemicals began to drip slowly into my veins. I sat there completely alone, watching the rhythmic drop of the clear fluid. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting maybe an apology text from my mother, or perhaps a mundane message from a client. Instead, it was an automated urgent alert from my bank. I opened the banking application, and the numbers on the screen made my blood run completely cold. My emergency savings account, the one holding the $15,000 I desperately needed to cover my impending treatments, showed a balance of exactly zero. The money had been completely drained via a massive withdrawal authorized in person just an hour ago. I stared at the transaction details, my breath catching painfully in my throat. The signature on the withdrawal form had been forged by my mother, but the account had been accessed legally. My father, Richard, still had his name listed as a legal custodian on that specific legacy account from when I first opened it as a teenager. They had not taken no for an answer. While I was sitting in a hospital chair fighting for my life, my family had stolen my only financial safety net to pay for a party on the beach. They had left me completely destitute. The realization washed over me like a tidal wave of ice. I was sick, I was broke, and I was entirely abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. I closed my eyes as the chemotherapy continued to drip, making a silent vow that I would survive this nightmare, and I would never ever let them hurt me again. The cold seeping into my veins from the IV line was nothing compared to the absolute ice flooding my chest as I stared at my banking application. $0. My emergency fund. The $15,000 I had sacrificed sleep, weekends, and holidays to build was entirely gone. Panic momentarily overrode the intense nausea churning in my stomach. With my free hand, the one not currently tethered to a bag of toxic chemicals, I dialed my bank customer service line. My fingers were stiff and clumsy, tapping the screen with desperate urgency. The hold music played a cheerful acoustic tune that felt entirely inappropriate for a woman sitting in an oncology ward, realizing she had just been robbed by her own blood. When a representative finally answered, I demanded to know where my money went, my voice cracking under the sterile fluorescent lights. The representative pulled up my account, and her tone shifted to complete professional detachment. She informed me that a withdrawal for the full amount had been authorized in person that exact morning. I told her that was impossible because I was hooked up to an IV drip in a hospital and my debit card was in my bag. There was a pause, and the rapid clicking of a keyboard echoed through the receiver. She explained that the transaction was fully authorized by Richard, the secondary account holder. My mind raced backward, hitting a solid wall of forgotten paperwork. The legacy account. When I was 16 years old, I opened that savings account with money from my very first summer job editing local commercials. My father had to be listed as a custodial signer because I was a minor at the time. Over the years, as I transitioned the account to a standard adult savings account, I simply never thought to remove his name. I had trusted him. He was my father. The representative apologized in that hollow corporate way and said that legally, he had full rights to withdraw the funds. The call ended, leaving me staring at the blank screen of my phone. My own father had walked into a local bank branch, utilized a legal loophole from over a decade ago, and drained my medical lifeline to pay for a destination wedding on a beach. A fresh wave of profound nausea hit me hard. I leaned over the armrest of the leather treatment chair and threw up into the plastic bin the nurse had left nearby. My body was violently rejecting the chemotherapy, but my mind was violently rejecting my reality. As I wiped my mouth with a rough paper towel, my phone buzzed in my lap. It was a notification from the bridal party group chat. I unlocked the screen foolishly, expecting maybe a shred of guilt, or a message asking if I was surviving my first day of poison. Instead, I saw a massive text block from Felicity sent to the entire group of bridesmaids. It read, "Just a quick update, ladies. Hazel is officially stepping down from bridal duties because she has some personal health stuff going on and cannot commit to the bright energy we need for the Bahamas. We are bumping the seating chart up. Do not forget to pack your matching silk robes for the flight tomorrow morning." There was absolutely no mention of cancer, no mention of chemotherapy. I was just a sister with vague personal health stuff who lacked the required aesthetic energy for beach photos. The responses from the other bridesmaids flooded in instantly. Heart emojis, champagne glass icons, and loud digital exclamations about how excited they were to drink margaritas on the white sand. I sat in the freezing infusion room, wrapping a thin, heated blanket tighter around my shaking shoulders, watching my family abandon me in real time. They were packing their designer luggage with the money they stole from my survival fund, completely unbothered by the fact that I was fighting for my life. The days following my first treatment were a blur of agonizing bone pain and feverish delirium. I lay in my dark apartment, shivering under layers of heavy blankets, unable to keep even plain water down. In my fever dreams, the past played in sharp, unforgiving detail. I remembered our last family Thanksgiving dinner vividly. I had just landed a major freelance contract for a corporate video campaign, and I was so incredibly proud to share the news. But before I could even finish my sentence, Felicity had rolled her eyes and laughed out loud. She told the entire dining table that my digital media work was just a cute hobby for people who could not get real corporate jobs. She swirled her expensive red wine and leaned heavily against Greg, her husband of 2 years. Greg was the ultimate golden son-in-law, a flashy tech startup founder who drove a sports car he leased and wore watches that cost more than my entire editing setup. My parents worshipped the ground Greg walked on. During that dinner, my mother Beverly had completely ignored my announcement and instead loudly praised Greg for being a visionary entrepreneur. She turned to me and said I should ask Greg for a job in his mailroom, insisting that maybe some of his corporate prestige would rub off on me and help me finally find a husband. They treated me like a naive child playing with cameras in a basement while they paraded Felicity and Greg around like royalty. They never respected my ambition. They never saw my late nights analyzing footage until my eyes burned. They only saw what they wanted to see, a quiet scapegoat to make their golden child shine much brighter. As the fever finally broke on the 4th night, the harsh reality settled over me in the absolute silence of my bedroom. They did not care about me. They only cared about the aesthetic of their perfect family, and a bald, sick daughter did not fit the vibrant destination wedding color palette. A week later, I was weak but functional enough to walk to my mailbox down the hall. Among the mounting stack of medical insurance statements and past due utility notices, I found a thick cream-colored envelope with Felicity's elegant return address label. I tore it open, expecting perhaps a belated get well card or a simple note checking to see if I was still breathing. Instead, a printed invoice fell out. It was a bill from a luxury bridal boutique for $800. Attached to the heavy cardstock invoice was a bright pink sticky note with Felicity's loopy handwriting. It read, "Since you bailed on the wedding at the last minute, the boutique refuses to refund the custom alterations. You still owe me for this dress. Please deposit the money to my account by Friday so I can pay off my honeymoon expenses." I stood in the narrow hallway, staring at the pink square of paper. I had lost my hair. I was losing my physical strength, and they had already stolen $15,000 from my bank account. Yet my sister had the unmitigated audacity to bill me for a dress I would never wear for a wedding I was effectively banned from attending. I walked back into my apartment and sat at my small kitchen table. I pulled out my checkbook. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw things. I felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over my entire mind. I wrote the check for exactly $800. I viewed it not as a debt paid to my entitled sister, but as a final, incredibly cheap price to completely sever ties with my toxic bloodline. It was the cost of my absolute freedom. I placed the check in an envelope and dropped it in the mail slot without a second thought. When I returned to my apartment, I picked up my phone. I went into my contacts and permanently blocked my mother, my father, Felicity, and Greg. I blocked every aunt and uncle who had liked those gorgeous photos of the Bahamas trip, while actively ignoring my existence. I deleted my social media accounts, so they could never glimpse into my life again. Over the next month, between my grueling radiation treatments and exhausting chemotherapy rounds, I quietly broke my apartment lease. I packed up my entire life into a few cardboard boxes and moved across the city to a new address, making sure to use a private mail forwarding service, so my physical location could never be traced back to me by anyone sharing my last name. I sat alone in my new empty living room on the first night in that apartment. The physical toll of the cancer was heavy, leaving my body bruised and battered, but the emotional weight I had carried for 29 years was miraculously gone. I looked at the bare white walls and made a silent, unbreakable vow to the empty room. I would fight this horrible disease with every ounce of analytical brilliance I possessed. I would rebuild my career from the absolute ashes they left behind. I would become so wildly successful, so incredibly powerful, and so entirely untouchable that they would never be able to reach me again. And if they ever dared to cross my path in the future, they would not find the weak, accommodating sister they left behind in the oncology ward. They would find a woman who owed them absolutely nothing. The silence of my new apartment became my absolute sanctuary. The next 12 months were undeniably the darkest of my entire life. I fought through the remaining rounds of grueling chemotherapy with a stubbornness born entirely of spite. When my hair began to fall out in jagged clumps on my pillow, I calmly walked into my bathroom, took a pair of clippers, and shaved my head down to the scalp. I did not shed a single tear over it. I took freelance video editing jobs from my bed, typing with aching, blistered fingers, while heavy anti-nausea medication pumped through my veins. I did not have a mother to bring me warm soup or a sister to hold my hand during the long, terrifying nights. I had only myself, and that proved to be more than enough. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, my oncologist walked into the examination room with a bright smile. The scans were completely clear. I was officially in remission. I walked out of that clinic, breathed in the sharp, cold autumn air, and felt my old self die right there on the pavement. The quiet, accommodating Hazel who begged for her toxic family to love her was gone forever. In her place was a woman forged in absolute fire. I took the meager earnings from my hospital bed hustle and poured every single cent into a new business entity. I stopped calling myself a freelance video editor. That title belonged to the girl my family mocked. I launched Vanguard Digital Strategy, a boutique media agency specializing in high-end corporate campaigns and forensic data analysis. My first client was a local real estate firm. They loved my aggressive, highly analytical approach to digital content. They referred me to a regional bank. The bank referred me to a national investment group. I channeled every ounce of trauma, every memory of my mother choosing a beach wedding over my life, into relentless, unyielding ambition. I worked 18-hour days. I learned the complex language of boardrooms, profit margins, and corporate acquisitions. I stopped waiting for opportunities and started hunting them down. Within 18 months, I moved out of my tiny workspace and hired my first 5 employees. By my third year in remission, Vanguard Digital hit $7 million in annual revenue. I was 32 years old and the CEO of an elite agency handling media accounts for Fortune 500 companies. I traded my tiny walk-up apartment for a sprawling penthouse in a luxury downtown high-rise. My new home featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, a massive marble kitchen, and a private balcony. I bought tailored designer suits. I drank expensive coffee. I built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and success. Through all of this rapid ascent, I remained a complete ghost to the people who shared my DNA. I had changed my phone number and my email address long ago. I meticulously scrubbed my personal past from the internet, ensuring that any search for my name only brought up my corporate entity and professional accolades. I made sure there was no trace of the weak girl they once knew. But I knew exactly what my parents and Felicity were doing. They were living loud, desperate lives on public social media profiles. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance from my old life would mention them, or I would catch a glimpse of their public posts. Beverly was still hosting her lavish country club luncheons, bragging loudly about Greg and his flashy tech startup. Richard was still enabling their financial delusions, paying for dinners and vacations they clearly could not afford. Felicity posted daily photos of designer handbags and luxury beach resorts, projecting the flawless image of a perfect wealthy wife. She lived for the validation of strangers. They assumed I was still a broke, struggling outcast. In their minds, I was likely living in a damp basement somewhere, barely scraping by to pay rent and wallowing in bitter jealousy over Felicity and her glamorous marriage. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel successful. Their entire reality was constructed on the fragile illusion of their superiority. They had spent 3 years completely ignoring my existence, deeply entrenched in their own materialistic fantasies. They never bothered to look for me because they assumed there was absolutely nothing worth finding. They thought they had won. They thought they had discarded the weakest link in their family chain. But while they were busy maxing out credit cards to maintain an illusion, I was busy building an empire in the shadows. I did not need to flaunt my wealth on the internet. I did not need their validation. My bank accounts, my staff, and my corporate contracts spoke for themselves. I had created a life so insulated and secure that the thought of my former family rarely even crossed my mind anymore. They were simply a bad memory, a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. It was a Friday evening, and the sky over the city was painted in brilliant shades of purple and gold. I was standing on the expansive balcony of my penthouse with Marcus, my lead strategist and right-hand man. The evening air was warm, and the city below us buzzed with electric energy. We were celebrating a monumental victory. Vanguard Digital had just finalized a massive acquisition deal, taking over the entire media strategy for a global tech conglomerate. It was the biggest contract in our agency history. Marcus smiled broadly and handed me a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. He raised his own glass toward the skyline. To the best CEO in the city, he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. We clinked our glasses together, the bright, crisp sound ringing out over the hum of the traffic far below. I took a slow sip, letting the sweet victory wash over me. My life was finally perfect. I was healthy, wealthy, and surrounded by people who valued my mind and my work. Then my phone lit up on the glass patio table. The screen displayed a text message from a completely unrecognized number. I frowned, setting my champagne down next to a potted fern. I picked up the device, expecting a message from a vendor, or perhaps a late congratulatory note from a client. The words on the glowing screen made my blood freeze instantly in my veins. The message was long and frantic, lacking any basic greeting or warmth. Hazel, it is your mother. I know you are probably still angry, but Felicity is in serious trouble. We got your new number from an old tax document Richard found. We need you at the house tonight. Bring your checkbook. I stared at the glowing letters, reading the message 3 times to ensure I was not hallucinating. After 3 years of absolute silence, after leaving me to face cancer alone, after stealing my life savings to fund a destination wedding, they did not even have the decency to ask how I was doing. They did not ask if I was still in remission. They did not ask if I was even alive. They simply demanded my presence and my money. Marcus noticed my rigid posture and the sudden shift in my expression. Is everything all right, Hazel? He asked, stepping closer with a concerned frown. Did the conglomerate pull out of the deal? I looked up from the phone and met his gaze. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. No, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dangerous register. The deal is perfectly fine. It seems an old ghost has just decided to haunt me, but they have no idea who they are trying to scare. I locked my phone and slipped it into the pocket of my tailored trousers. The sheer audacity of my mother's demand was almost comical. Bring your checkbook. They still thought I was the subservient, desperate daughter who would hand over her last dime to buy their affection. They thought they could summon me like a disobedient servant. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. I stood on the balcony a few moments longer, letting the cool evening wind ruffle my hair. My hair that had grown back thick and dark, a stark contrast to the bald, trembling woman they last saw. I thought about the $15,000 they stole from me. To the Hazel of 3 years ago, that money was the difference between life and death. To the Hazel standing on this penthouse balcony, $15,000 was a fraction of what I billed a client for a single morning consultation. The financial disparity between who I was and who they thought I was staggering. Beverly's text message was a glaring beacon of desperation. For my mother to swallow her immense pride and track down my phone number through archaic tax records meant the situation with Felicity was catastrophic. Greg, the brilliant tech founder, must have finally hit a wall, his fragile house of cards collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. They were panicking, they were drowning, and they were looking for anyone to throw them a life preserver. I walked back into my spacious living room, the hardwood floors cool beneath my bare feet. I looked at the sleek modern furniture, the expensive art on the walls, and the security of the life I had built entirely on my own. I did not need to go to them. I could simply block this new number and continue living my flawless existence. I owed them absolutely nothing. They had forfeited their right to my time, my money, and my empathy the day they boarded that flight to the Bahamas. Yet the analytical side of my brain, the part that dismantled corporate competitors and strategized hostile takeovers, was buzzing with intense curiosity. I wanted to see the look on their faces. I wanted to watch them try to manipulate me one last time. I wanted to look my sister in the eye and see the exact moment she realized the punching bag she discarded had become a titan. I walked over to my entryway console and picked up my keys. I did not change out of my casual evening clothes. I would not give them the satisfaction of looking wealthy just yet. I would play their game. I would walk into that house looking exactly like the unassuming broken girl they expected. I would let them dig their own graves with their demands and their insults. I texted my mother back with a single simple word. Okay. I grabbed my unassuming leather tote bag, ignoring the designer purses sitting on the shelf above it. I slid my checkbook into the side pocket, feeling the smooth paper against my fingertips. I was going to bring exactly what she asked for. But Beverly and Felicity were completely unaware that the checkbook they were so eager to drain was attached to a bank account with more zeros than they had ever seen in their lives. The trap was set, and they were eagerly holding the door open for me to walk right in. I parked my unassuming rental car 2 blocks away from my parents' sprawling suburban estate. My personal security detail and my custom town car were safely waiting back at the Vanguard Digital Underground garage. I had dressed specifically for this performance, wearing a faded gray cardigan, a plain white t-shirt, and a pair of worn denim jeans I had dug out from the back of my closet. I left my diamond watch and tailored coat in my penthouse. I needed my family to see exactly what they expected to see. a broken, struggling outcast who had come crawling back the second she was summoned. Walking up the manicured stone pathway, I felt an unexpected wave of profound calm. 3 years ago, simply approaching this heavy oak door would have sent my heart racing with anxiety. I would have been desperate for a scrap of validation, hoping my parents might finally look at me with pride. Now I was walking into the lion's den with the cold, calculating mindset of a corporate CEO preparing to dissect a failing competitor. I pressed the doorbell and waited. Beverly pulled the door open before the chime even finished ringing. Her face was tight, her expensive makeup slightly smudged around the edges of her eyes. She did not pull me into a hug. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply grabbed my upper arm with a bruising grip and hauled me into the foyer. "You certainly took your time," she snapped, her voice sharp and frantic. "I told you this was an emergency, Hazel." The living room looked exactly the same as it had when they threw me out, but the energy in the space was suffocatingly toxic. Felicity was sprawled dramatically across the tufted velvet sofa, weeping into her hands with theatrical perfection. Her designer mascara was carefully smeared to indicate maximum distress. Her husband Greg was pacing holes into the antique Persian rug. His expensive tailored suit looked slept in, and he was chewing aggressively on his thumbnail. My father Richard stood by the stone fireplace, projecting a rigid false authority that barely masked his underlying panic. I stood in the center of the room, waiting for the inevitable question. It had been 3 entire years since I faced death alone. My hair had grown back thick and dark, my skin was glowing with health, and my posture was completely different. But as the silence stretched on, the reality of their narcissism became glaringly obvious. Nobody asked about my health. Nobody asked if my oncology scans were clear. Nobody asked if I was still in remission, or if I was even managing to survive. To my parents and my sister, my cancer was simply an inconvenient plot hole they had successfully skipped over. I was breathing, and therefore I was available to serve their needs. Richard pointed a commanding finger at a wooden accent chair. "Sit down, Hazel. We do not have time for pleasantries tonight." I remained standing, crossing my arms loosely over my chest. "I prefer to stand," I replied, keeping my voice completely neutral. "Beverly texted me that Felicity is in trouble. What is going on?" Greg stopped pacing and ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "It is just a minor speed bump," he said, his voice pitching higher than usual. "My startup is going through a massive scaling phase, and we hit a temporary liquidity issue. A vendor dispute tied up our primary capital reserves. It is standard corporate red tape, but we need an immediate injection of cash to bridge the gap until the quarterly funding clears." I recognized the panicked jargon instantly. In my line of work, I audited failing executives every single week. Greg was not experiencing a minor speed bump. He was bleeding cash, his investors were likely pulling out, and he was desperately trying to stop a sinking ship. He reeked of stale scotch and sheer desperation. Richard stepped forward, taking charge of the narrative. "The bank is being completely unreasonable regarding Greg's business credit. We have already extended ourselves as much as we comfortably can right now. Therefore, Hazel, you are going to take out a personal loan. Greg needs $300,000 by Friday morning." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air. I looked from my father to Greg, and then down to my weeping sister. "You want me to take out a $300,000 loan?" I asked, pretending to sound intimidated. "You must have some credit available since you clearly have not been doing much with your life," Beverly chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. "You live in some tiny apartment editing those little videos of yours. You have no real expenses. You can take out a second mortgage if you own whatever shoebox you live in. You can max out your credit cards. You can take out signature loans. We do not care how you get the money, Hazel, but you are going to get it." Felicity finally looked up from her hands, her face twisted with a familiar ugly entitlement. "You owe us, Hazel," she whined, her voice grating on my nerves. "You ruined the entire vibe of my wedding with your depressing medical drama. You made my entire bridal experience about you and your illness. Greg is a visionary tech founder. He is building our future. You have to help his company survive." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep a genuine smile from breaking across my face. They were demanding that a woman they believed was completely broke destroy her entire financial future to bail out a man who leased sports cars for social media clout. It was the absolute pinnacle of their delusion. "Listen to me," Richard said, using the deep, commanding tone he used to terrify me with as a teenager. "Since you are single and clearly do not have a real family to support it, is your duty to help your sister's marriage. Do not be a selfish spinster. Families make sacrifices, Hazel. Felicity and Greg are building a legacy. You are just existing. It is time you contributed something of actual value to this family." I let the silence stretch, letting them stew in their own frantic energy. I needed them to believe I was crumbling under their intense social pressure. I looked down at my worn denim jeans, shifting my weight uncomfortably to play the part of the meek, obedient scapegoat. $300,000 is a massive amount of debt to take on, I said softly, keeping my voice hesitant and quiet. If I am going to go to the bank and beg for that kind of money, I need to see Greg's financial records. I just want to make sure my money is safe before I sign my life away. Greg scoffed loudly, the sound thick with pure, unadulterated arrogance. He looked at me with an expression of absolute contempt, shaking his head as if I had just asked a wildly stupid question. He walked over to his leather briefcase sitting on the console table, snapped the brass clasps open, and dug around inside. He pulled out a heavy silver flash drive. Without walking over to hand it to me, he simply tossed it across the living room like a piece of worthless garbage. I caught the drive smoothly in my right hand, my fingers closing tightly around the cool metal. "Knock yourself out," Greg sneered, crossing his arms and leaning back against the wall. "All the quarterly projections, investor ledgers, and metadata are on that drive. But do not hurt your little brain trying to read it, Hazel. You are just a freelance video editor. Those are complex tech financials, not a wedding montage. You would need a degree in corporate finance to even begin to understand the scaling algorithms I am using. Just look at the bottom line and go to the bank tomorrow." I gripped the flash drive in my palm, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the keys to his entire criminal existence over to the CEO of Vanguard Digital Strategy. He had no idea that my agency employed the most ruthless forensic data analysts in the Midwest. He thought he was tossing confusing numbers at a poor, uneducated girl. I looked at their smug, desperate faces. My father standing tall with false pride. My mother glaring at me with impatient irritation. My sister wiping away her fake tears now that she thought she had secured her bailout. "I will do my absolute best to understand it," I said quietly, slipping the flash drive into the front pocket of my faded cardigan. "I will let you know what I find." I walked out of my parents' front door without another word. The heavy oak slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Felicity's theatrical sobbing and Greg's nervous pacing. I slid into the driver's seat of my rental car and tossed the silver flash drive onto the passenger seat. It looked so small and insignificant sitting there on the cheap fabric, but I knew it was a loaded weapon. I drove back to downtown Chicago, the city lights blurring past my windows as I mentally prepared for the night ahead. When I reached my penthouse, I bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for my home office. This room was the nerve center of Vanguard Digital Strategy outside of our main headquarters. It was equipped with military-grade encrypted servers and processing power that Greg could not even fathom. I set the silver drive on my polished mahogany desk and pulled out my phone. I dialed Marcus, my lead strategist, and David, the head of our forensic data analytics department. It was late on a Friday night, but my team knew that when I called with an urgent directive, they needed to drop everything. Within 20 minutes, both men were logged into my secure remote server ready to assist. I plugged Greg's flash drive into an isolated terminal. I did not want any of his potentially infected files touching my primary network. The drive popped up on my screen. It was a chaotic mess of poorly organized spreadsheets, generic profit and loss statements, and vendor invoices. At first glance, it looked exactly like what Greg had claimed. It looked like a struggling tech startup facing a temporary cash flow problem. But I did not hire the best forensic analysts in the Midwest to look at the surface. "David, pull apart the metadata on the hidden partitions," I instructed through the secure audio channel. "Greg is arrogant, but he is not careful. Dig into the deleted file registry and trace the original routing numbers on those vendor invoices." For the next 3 hours, my office was silent, except for the rapid clicking of my keyboard and the low hum of the servers. We methodically stripped away the protective layers of Greg's financial facade. The first major red flag appeared just after midnight. David found a hidden ledger completely separate from the official documents Greg intended for me to see. The numbers on the screen told a terrifying story. Greg was not experiencing a minor liquidity issue. He had committed massive federal wire fraud. The tech startup was nothing more than a hollow shell game. Greg had been soliciting millions of dollars from private investors under the guise of funding revolutionary software development. But there was no software. There was no development team. Instead, the incoming investor capital was immediately routed through a complex web of offshore shell companies. Marcus traced the outgoing wires and matched them directly to Greg and Felicity's personal expenses. The investors were funding the luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, the constant trips to five-star resorts, and the massive payments on their lavish downtown loft. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, and it was collapsing rapidly because the initial investors were finally demanding their quarterly returns. "This is bad," Hazel Marcus said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "He has defrauded these people out of at least $4 million. If the authorities see this, he is looking at serious federal prison time." "Keep digging," I replied, leaning closer to my monitors. The glow of the screens reflected in the dark window panes of my office. If he is this desperate, there is more. Look at the personal credit lines he used to secure the initial shell companies. 10 minutes later, David sent a priority alert to my main screen. "Hazel, you need to look at the tax document folder he tried to scrub from the drive last week. I managed to recover the cached files." I opened the folder. The first document was a standard credit application for a high-yield business loan. I scanned the borrower information expecting to see Greg's name. Instead, my breath caught sharply in my throat. Staring back at me in stark black and white was my own name, Hazel Marie Sterling. Below my name was my actual social security number, my old apartment address, and my previous banking details. I felt a cold wave of pure revulsion wash over my entire body. I clicked through the rest of the recovered files, my hand gripping the mouse so tightly my knuckles turned white. There were dozens of them. Fraudulent credit card applications, massive personal loans, retail credit lines maxed out to their absolute limits. For the past 3 years, while I was sitting in freezing hospital rooms, fighting through chemotherapy and clawing my way back to life, my sister and her husband had been actively stealing my identity. They had exploited the fact that I was completely disconnected from my old life. When I launched Vanguard Digital, I established new corporate entities and built a completely new secure financial profile. I had abandoned my old personal accounts when I changed my address to escape them. Felicity and Greg had realized this. They assumed I was either going to die from the cancer or remain too poor and broken to ever check my credit report. They had systematically destroyed my old financial identity to fund their glamorous illusion. They bought $1,000 shoes and booked luxury yachts using my social security number, deliberately burying me in hundreds of thousands of dollars of fraudulent debt. It was a level of depravity that went far beyond simple greed. It was a calculated, malicious effort to ruin my life while they danced on the ashes. Marcus and David were silent on the communication line, clearly horrified by what they had just uncovered. I did not shed a tear. I did not panic. The white-hot rage burning in my chest crystallized into pure absolute focus. "Trace the bridge loan," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Greg told my father he was waiting on a quarterly funding round, but there is a massive cash injection showing up on the ledger from 6 months ago. Find out exactly where that money came from." We pivoted our attack following the digital trail of a $300,000 deposit that had temporarily kept Greg's fraudulent company afloat. The routing numbers did not match any of the previous private investors. They did not originate from a corporate bank or a venture capital firm. David isolated the origin point and brought the source documents onto my screen. The money had come from a local regional bank in the Chicago suburbs. It was a direct wire transfer from a home equity line of credit. I opened the attached property deed and stared at the names listed on the mortgage. Richard and Beverly Sterling. My parents. My wealthy, status-obsessed parents, who constantly mocked my career and threw me out of their house, had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their sprawling suburban estate. They had liquidated their entire retirement portfolio and leveraged the only asset they had left to bail out their golden son-in-law. They had handed Greg every single cent to his name, believing his lies about a temporary cash flow problem. And the absolute worst part was glaring at me from the outgoing ledger. Greg had completely blown their money. Within 2 months of receiving my parents' bridge loan, Greg had spent the entire $300,000 paying off angry investors and funding a lavish anniversary trip to Monaco for Felicity. The money was entirely gone. I cross-referenced the dates with the hidden emails between Felicity and Greg. Felicity knew. She knew her husband was a fraud. She knew they had stolen my identity. And she knew that her parents were currently living in a house they could no longer afford. I found the final piece of the puzzle buried in a scanned document folder. It was a foreclosure warning notice addressed to Richard and Beverly Sterling dated 2 weeks ago. My parents were completely bankrupt. They were weeks away from losing their country club membership, their luxury cars, and the very roof over their heads. Felicity was desperately trying to force me to take out a loan because it was the only way to hide the truth from our parents before the bank seized their home. They were using my parents' blind faith in Greg to destroy them, and they were trying to use my perceived weakness to save themselves. I leaned back in my leather office chair, the magnitude of the situation settling heavily in the silent room. The people who had laughed at my cancer diagnosis, who had stolen my life savings to buy wedding flowers, and who had called me a selfish spinster just hours ago, were completely at my mercy. I held the absolute destruction of my entire family on a single silver flash drive. David Marcus, I said, breaking the silence on the audio channel. Package every single file on this drive into a secure encrypted dossier. Cross-reference the fraudulent credit applications with the wire fraud statutes. I want a complete ironclad forensic report ready by Monday morning. We are going to build a cage they can never escape. I terminated the secure connection and turned off the monitors. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights outside my window. I walked over to the glass, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and smiled. They wanted me to save them. They wanted me to be the good, obedient daughter who sacrificed her own future to maintain their perfect illusion. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them a family reunion they would never forget. I sat in the cool silver glow of my monitors, long after David and Marcus had logged off the secure channel for the night. Sleep was an entirely impossible concept. The sheer scale of the betrayal pulsed through my veins, hot and demanding. My parents willingly throwing away their entire retirement to save face was tragic in its own pathetic way, but the identity theft was something else entirely. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. Greg was a flashy, arrogant tech bro, but he had never struck me as meticulously criminal. He was too impulsive, too focused on the visual aesthetics of success. Someone else had to be directing the traffic and pulling the strings. I initiated a deep recovery protocol on the cached communication files David had quarantined on the isolated server. Greg had tried to wipe his personal email server from the drive, using a basic commercial scrubbing software, completely ignorant of how digital footprints actually work. Within 40 minutes, I had bypassed the corrupted sectors and pulled up a massive trove of deleted email exchanges between Greg and my sister. I opened a thread dated exactly 3 years ago, right around the time I was hospitalized for my grueling second round of chemotherapy. Greg was complaining bitterly about a denied credit application for a luxury sports vehicle. He was whining to his wife that his startup capital was temporarily tied up, and he desperately needed a clean credit profile to secure a personal line of credit to maintain their image. Felicity's response was time-stamped at 2 in the morning. The text sat on my screen, cold and unyielding. It read, "Just use Hazel's info. It is not like she will ever need good credit anyway. She has pristine scores from all those years saving money in that pathetic little apartment. She is probably not going to make it through the year, and even if she does, she is too weak to ever do anything about it. Just take it." I read the words until the letters blurred together into a meaningless gray smudge. My own sister. while I was vomiting bile into plastic hospital bins, praying my white blood cell count would stabilize enough to simply keep me alive. She was casually harvesting my social security number to buy a luxury car. She was not an innocent wife blindly trusting her visionary husband. She was the malicious architect of my financial destruction. She had weaponized my cancer diagnosis to fund her superficial vanity. I highlighted the entire thread, exported the raw data, and dropped it straight into the encrypted dossier Marcus had started. The steel bars of their cage were getting tighter. The sun was just beginning to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of bruised purple and dull orange, when my personal cell phone buzzed on my mahogany desk. I glanced at the caller ID. It was the new number Beverly had texted me from, but I knew instantly who was on the other end of the line. I pressed a button on my keyboard to activate my office's forensic recording software, routed the call through my secure server, and picked up the phone. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice soft and subdued, playing the part of the compliant, terrified victim they expected me to be. "You better be standing outside a bank right now, Hazel." Felicity's voice blasted through the speaker, sharp and dripping with absolute venom. She did not bother with a basic greeting. "Greg needs that money transferred by tomorrow morning, or we are going to lose our primary vendor contracts. I swear to God, if you ruin this for us because you are too stupid to fill out a simple loan application, I will never forgive you." I leaned back in my leather executive chair, watching the green audio waves peak and dip on my monitor. "I am looking at the numbers, Felicity," I murmured hesitantly. "The bank might need more time. $300,000 is a massive amount of money for me to borrow." "It is not a lot of money for normal, successful people," she snapped, her impatience echoing loudly through my silent office. "But of course you would think it is. You live a sad, lonely life in whatever pathetic hole you rent. You do not have a husband. You do not have a real family. You literally do nothing but edit stupid little videos for local nobodies. We are building an empire, Hazel. You owe this to us. Greg is going to change the entire world, and you are trying to drag us down just because you are a jealous, bitter spinster." I let the silence hang for a long moment, ensuring the recording software captured the absolute clarity of her profound entitlement. "I am just trying to be careful," I whispered, letting a slight manufactured tremor enter my voice. "Careful?" she mocked, laughing harshly into the receiver. "You are just being incredibly selfish. Listen to me very closely, Hazel. If you do not sign those loan papers and wire that money to Greg by Friday afternoon, I will go on Facebook and tell our entire extended family exactly what kind of person you really are. I will tell all my followers how you abandoned your family during a massive crisis. I will publicly shame you for turning your back on your sister when she needed you most. You will not be able to show your face anywhere in this city without people knowing you are a monster. Do you understand me?" The threat was incredibly precise and utterly revealing. She knew exactly how much our parents cared about their public image, and she assumed I shared that same desperate, pathetic need for social approval. She thought the threat of public humiliation would break my spirit. She thought I was still the fragile, accommodating girl who cried when her mother ignored her career milestones. "I understand perfectly, Felicity," I said, my voice entirely smooth and devoid of any panic. "I will see what I can do by Friday." I hung up the phone before she could scream another insult. I immediately exported the high-definition audio file, ran a quick voice authentication protocol to verify the source, and dragged it into the secure digital dossier. I had her written confession of federal identity theft, and now I had her on tape actively attempting extortion and blackmail. The digital landmine she was sitting on was packed with enough high explosives to completely obliterate her entire world. I did not need to argue with her or defend my lonely life. I just needed to stand back and let her keep digging her own grave. By Tuesday morning, the air in the Vanguard Digital Strategy headquarters was buzzing with its usual corporate intensity. My agency occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass building in the financial district, a monument to the empire I had built from the ashes of my past. I walked through the sliding glass doors, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, my designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floors. My staff offered respectful nods as I made my way to my corner office overlooking the city. Marcus was already waiting for me, a thick printed file resting squarely on the center of my desk. "The dossier is fully complete, Hazel," he said, his expression completely serious and professional. We have certified traces on every single fraudulent account Greg and Felicity opened in your name. We have the internal wire transfer logs proving your parents secretly mortgaged their estate to bail him out 6 months ago. We have absolute undeniable proof of the entire Ponzi scheme. Whenever you are ready to hand this over to the federal authorities, we have the bow tied perfectly. I ran my hand over the heavy cardstock of the file, feeling the weight of their imminent destruction. It was a masterpiece of forensic data collection. Thank you, Marcus, I said quietly. I just need to figure out exactly how I want to drop the hammer. I want them all in a room together when the reality finally hits them. Before Marcus could respond, my private office line chimed loudly. It was the dedicated priority line, a heavily encrypted number given only to my top 3 corporate clients. I tapped the speaker button on the console. Vanguard Digital, Hazel speaking. Hazel, it is Jonathan Sterling from Apex Investment Group. Jonathan was the senior acquisition director for one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the country. Apex was my biggest, most lucrative client. They specialized in buying up failing tech companies, gutting them for parts, liquidating the assets, and selling off the intellectual property to the highest bidder. Jonathan, it is always a pleasure, I said, leaning forward in my chair. What can Vanguard do for you today? We need your forensic team to move immediately on a priority target, Jonathan said, his voice clipped and strictly business. We are looking at acquiring a distressed media tech startup right here in the city. The founder is absolutely desperate for a buyout to cover some massive vendor liabilities. He is practically begging us to take the company off his hands for pennies on the dollar, just to avoid a highly public bankruptcy. I picked up a silver pen, twirling it smoothly between my fingers. Sounds like a standard corporate acquisition, Jonathan. What exactly is the problem? Our preliminary due diligence is throwing up some major red flags, Jonathan explained, a hint of genuine disgust in his tone. The profit and loss statements look incredibly cooked. We strongly suspect the founder has been running a massive shell game with his private investor capital. If we acquire the company, we acquire the financial liability, and I am absolutely not buying a federal wire fraud case. I need Vanguard to do a complete deep dive digital audit on their servers. I need you to tear his financials apart and tell me exactly how much money this guy has stolen before we sign a single piece of paper. I can certainly handle that for you, Jonathan, I said, my heart beginning a slow, steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I locked eyes with Marcus, who was standing perfectly still beside my desk, listening to the exchange. What is the name of the startup? Jonathan sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by the sheer incompetence of his acquisition target. The company is called OmniStream Dynamics. The founder is a guy named Greg Vance. I need your elite team inside their systems by tomorrow morning. Can you get it done? My pen stopped twirling. The absolute magnificent perfection of the universe suddenly unfolded before my eyes. Greg had not just gone to my parents for a bailout. He was actively trying to sell his fraudulent, empty shell of a company to my biggest corporate client. He was trying to dump his massive criminal liability onto Apex Investment Group, completely unaware that the CEO of the forensic agency evaluating his entire existence was the exact same woman whose identity he had stolen to fund his pathetic lifestyle. I smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that made Marcus take a slight, involuntary step back. Consider it completely handled, Jonathan, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. We will tear him apart. The moment I disconnected the line with Jonathan, the atmosphere in my office shifted from quiet investigation to absolute weaponized mobilization. Marcus did not need another word of instruction. He was already typing frantically on his secure terminal, authorizing our legal team to accept the Apex Investment Group contract. Within an hour, the digital ink was dry on a non-disclosure agreement and a blanket authorization contract that granted Vanguard Digital Strategy full unrestricted access to every hidden corner of OmniStream Dynamics. I was no longer just a curious sister digging through a stolen flash drive. I was a federally bonded forensic auditor, armed with absolute subpoena power. I brought in my top 3 data analysts, locking the heavy glass doors of the conference room and projecting Greg's entire digital life onto the massive wall monitors. We worked through the weekend, fueled by black coffee and the sheer adrenaline of uncovering a truly spectacular corporate fraud. With Apex's legal backing, I bypassed Greg's pathetic consumer-grade firewalls and gained direct access to his cloud servers, his internal corporate communications, and his banking portals. It was not a financial review. It was a digital autopsy. What we found over the next 48 hours was staggering. Greg had not simply exaggerated his profit margins to impress investors. He had fabricated an entire user base out of thin air. OmniStream Dynamics claimed to have 300,000 active daily users. Our server ping analysis revealed they had barely 300. He had hired cheap overseas click farms to generate fake web traffic, presenting those inflated numbers to private equity firms to secure rounds of bridge funding. But the corporate fraud was just the beginning. I directed David to cross-reference Greg's corporate IP addresses with the fraudulent credit card applications taken out in my name. The results popped onto the screen with devastating clarity. Every single application, every maxed-out retail card, and every massive personal loan had been initiated from the exact same IP address assigned to Greg and Felicity's luxury loft. They had not even bothered to use a basic proxy server to hide their digital fingerprints. I dug deeper into the metadata, pulling up the deleted internal chat logs between my sister and her husband. I needed to know exactly how complicit Felicity was. I found my answer in a heavily encrypted chat folder Greg had tried to wipe. The messages were sickeningly clear. Felicity was not a naive wife being strung along by a deceptive husband. She was the chief operating officer of my financial destruction. I stared at a specific message sent from her device just months after my cancer treatments ended. Greg had texted her expressing mild panic about a bank demanding identity verification for a new line of credit. Felicity's response was cold, calculated, and completely devoid of empathy. She wrote, "Just use Hazel's info. It is not like she will ever need good credit anyway. She is probably going to be single and renting for the rest of her life. Just take it and get the funding approved so we can book the Monaco trip." My own sister. She had viewed my existence as nothing more than a convenient resource to be drained. I highlighted the chat logs, exported the raw server data, and compiled everything into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. It was indisputable. While my team finalized the reporting for Apex, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the conference table. I glanced at the screen. Felicity was calling. She was completely unaware of the digital landmine she was currently sitting on. I gestured for Marcus to remain quiet, tapped the record button on my secure software, and answered the call. "Are you at the bank yet?" Felicity demanded, her voice shrill and echoing through the speakerphone. "Greg needs that wire transfer initiated by tomorrow morning." "I am reviewing the paperwork now," I said softly, injecting a perfectly calibrated tone of nervous hesitation into my voice. "It is just a lot of money, Felicity. I want to make sure I am doing the right thing." "You are doing what you are told," she snapped back, the vicious entitlement radiating from the device. "Do you seriously think you have a choice here, Hazel? You owe us. You have a sad, lonely life. You have no husband, no children, and no real future. The least you can do is support the people in this family who actually matter. If you do not sign those loan papers and transfer that money by Friday, I will ruin you. I will go on Facebook and tell all of our relatives how you abandoned your family during a financial crisis. I will publicly shame you as a selfish, bitter spinster. You will never be able to show your face at another holiday dinner again." I did not argue with her. I did not defend my life or my choices. I simply let her hurl her insults, capturing every single threat on the secure recording. "I understand," I said quietly. "I will get it done." I ended the call and saved the audio file directly into the finalized Apex dossier. It was the perfect cherry on top of a highly illegal sundae. Now it was time to set the trap. I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to my mother. I needed to play the part of the meek, desperate daughter begging for her family's affection. I carefully selected my words to stroke Beverly's massive ego. "Mom," I typed. I looked at the files. "It is a terrifying amount of money, but I want to help Greg. I will take out the loan. I just want to be part of the family again. I want to be welcomed back. Can we meet to sign the paperwork?" The response came back less than 3 minutes later. Beverly was practically salivating at the thought of reeling me back into her control. She agreed to meet for a reconciliation dinner to finalize the transfer. But there was a catch. She did not want to meet in Chicago. Greg was supposedly flying out to pitch a massive tech merger to an investment group on the West Coast. Beverly demanded I fly to meet them in Seattle on Thursday night. She texted me the flight details and the name of the restaurant, adding a condescending note that I should try to dress nicely, so I did not embarrass them in front of Greg's potential new partners. They were staying at a five-star hotel in downtown Seattle, bleeding the last drops of their maxed-out credit cards to project wealth to the investment group they were desperately trying to con. They wanted me to fly across the country to hand-deliver my own financial execution. I smiled at my phone. Seattle was where Apex Investment Group was headquartered. Greg was flying there to pitch his fraudulent company to my client, entirely unaware that his executioner was already on the payroll. I booked a first-class ticket to Seattle. I packed the heavy printed copy of the Vanguard Digital Audit into a sleek leather portfolio. I no longer needed to hide behind the faded cardigan and the worn denim jeans. The time for playing the impoverished outcast was officially over. I was going to walk into that restaurant looking exactly like the titan they had unknowingly created. I selected my wardrobe with the precision of a general preparing for war. I chose an immaculate razor-sharp designer suit in a deep charcoal gray. The cut was aggressive and commanding, projecting absolute authority. I paired it with a silk blouse, a subtle but astronomically expensive diamond watch, and a pair of stiletto heels that echoed with power. I packed my favorite designer handbag, a structured piece of Italian leather that cost more than Greg's leased sports car. The flight to Seattle was peaceful. I drank sparkling water and reviewed the final pages of the dossier. Every wire transfer, every fake user account, every stolen identity marker was cataloged, indexed, and legally certified. Greg was looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. Felicity was looking at accessory to wire fraud and identity theft. My parents were looking at absolute irreversible bankruptcy. They had handed Greg the keys to their estate, and he had driven it straight off a financial cliff. When my town car pulled up to the upscale restaurant in downtown Seattle, a heavy cold rain was falling over the city. The valet opened my door with a respectful nod, and I stepped out onto the wet pavement, smoothing the lapels of my suit. The restaurant was a fortress of quiet wealth. It featured towering glass walls, modern crystal chandeliers, and an atmosphere of intense exclusivity. Beverly had chosen this venue specifically because she wanted a highly public, wealthy audience to witness her perceived control and status. She wanted to show off her successful family while graciously allowing her pathetic poor daughter to sit at the edge of the table. I walked through the heavy glass doors, handing my coat to the coat check attendant. The maitre d' smiled warmly, asking for my reservation name. I told him I was joining an existing party and stepped into the main dining room. I spotted them immediately. They were seated at a large prime center table strategically positioned to command the attention of the room. Greg was wearing a flashy velvet blazer, leaning back in his chair with a false posture of relaxed confidence. Felicity was draped in a silk designer gown, holding a menu with manicured fingers. Beverly and Richard sat opposite them, looking smug and expectant. I stood near the entrance, hidden by a large decorative column, simply watching them for a moment. They were laughing loudly, clinking expensive crystal wine glasses together in a celebratory toast. They were ordering vintage champagne and premium steaks on credit cards they could no longer pay off. They were celebrating a massive corporate buyout they believed was happening the very next morning, completely oblivious to the reality that they were entirely bankrupt, completely destitute, and mere days away from federal indictments. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked like a perfect, flawless family. I adjusted the strap of my heavy designer bag, feeling the solid weight of the printed dossier resting inside. It was the weight of their impending ruin. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, analytical calm settle completely over my mind. The days of Hazel the victim were dead and buried. I stepped out from behind the column and began walking deliberately across the dining room floor. My heels clicked a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the polished marble tiles. I kept my head high, my expression completely unreadable, and my eyes locked dead onto my mother's face. I was not walking to a family dinner. I was walking to an execution, As I approached the center table, the sheer scale of my mother's manipulative theatrics came into full view. Beverly had not just summoned the core group for this financial execution. She had orchestrated an entire audience. Seated alongside my parents and my sister were Aunt Miriam and Uncle Thomas, my father's wealthy brother, and his perpetually judgmental wife. Next to them sat Cousin Beatrice, who had always acted as Felicity's personal cheerleader. Beverly had invited the most gossipy, highly critical branches of our family tree to witness my absolute submission. She wanted a crowd to watch me sign my life away, so that if I dared to back out, she would have immediate witnesses to my supposed selfishness. They did not notice me until I was standing directly at the edge of their table. The laughter died abruptly. Felicity's eyes darted instantly to my structured Italian leather handbag and the immaculate cut of my charcoal suit. For a fraction of a second, pure shock registered on her face before she quickly masked it with a sneer. She leaned over to Greg, whispering something that was undoubtedly a snide comment about me renting designer clothes just to impress them. Beverly looked me up and down, her lips pursing into a tight, thin line. She had expected me to arrive in my usual faded denim and oversized sweaters, looking defeated and desperate. Instead, I stood before them looking like the corporate executioner I was. "Well, do not just stand there hovering like a stray dog," Beverly snapped, waving her hand dismissively toward an empty chair squeezed at the very end of the table next to Uncle Thomas. "Sit down, Hazel. You are drawing attention." I pulled out the chair and sat, placing my heavy designer bag squarely on the pristine white tablecloth directly next to my water glass. The physical weight of the dossier inside landed with a solid thud that made the crystal wine glasses vibrate. Aunt Miriam leaned across the table, her heavy perfume masking the scent of the roasted garlic from the kitchen. "It is so good of your mother to invite you tonight, Hazel. We were all just discussing how wonderful it is that you are finally ready to be a productive member of this family. It takes a lot of maturity to admit when you have been wrong." Beverly smiled magnanimously, raising her glass of vintage Cabernet. She spoke loudly, ensuring her voice carried not just to our extended family, but to the adjacent tables of wealthy Seattle elites. "We have always believed in second chances, Miriam. Family is family, after all. Hazel has had a difficult few years finding her way and making some very poor choices, but we are willing to forgive all of that. We are opening our arms to her again. It is time for the prodigal daughter to finally come to her senses and stop being so terribly stubborn." Felicity chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Exactly. We just want Hazel to feel included. Greg is on the verge of closing a massive corporate buyout with Apex Investment Group tomorrow morning. We are about to step into an entirely new stratosphere of wealth, and we did not want Hazel to be completely left behind in her sad little apartment. Giving her the opportunity to help bridge this tiny cash flow gap is our way of letting her share in Greg's massive success. It is a privilege, really." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not defend myself. I did not argue against the grotesque rewriting of reality. I simply nodded slightly and took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Let them talk. Let them build their towering monument of lies higher and higher into the sky. The higher they built it, the more devastating the impact would be when I completely shattered the foundation. While Felicity and Beverly held court, basking in the glow of their own perceived magnanimity, I shifted my attention to Greg. The confident, arrogant tech bro facade he had projected when I first walked into the restaurant was rapidly melting away. The ambient temperature in the dining room was comfortably cool, but Greg was sweating profusely. A sheen of nervous perspiration coated his forehead, and his complexion had turned a sickly shade of gray. I was barely touching his expensive steak. Instead, his eyes were glued to his phone, which he kept hidden under the edge of the tablecloth. The screen illuminated his lap with a harsh blue light every few seconds as a relentless stream of notifications poured in. I knew exactly what those notifications were. They were not congratulations from investors. They were automated alerts from his banking portals. They were furious emails from the offshore shell companies demanding their quarterly returns. They were panic messages from his fake click farm vendors whose payments had bounced. Greg was drowning and the water was rising fast. He picked up his crystal water goblet with a violently shaking hand, spilling several drops onto his velvet blazer. He did not even notice. "Are you quite all right, Greg?" Uncle Thomas boomed, his loud voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "You look like you are about to pass out, son. Closing a multi-million-dollar deal tomorrow must have your nerves completely fried." Greg jumped, almost dropping his glass. He forced a sickeningly artificial smile onto his pale face. "Just fine, Thomas. Just anticipating the final paperwork. Apex is a demanding firm, but we are fully prepared to meet their requirements. The buyout is absolutely guaranteed." I took another sip of my water, watching a bead of sweat roll down the side of Greg's face. He was lying through his teeth and the sheer terror in his eyes was palpable. He desperately needed the $300,000 loan from me to temporarily placate his most aggressive creditors before the Apex acquisition team dug too deep into his fraudulent servers. He had no idea that the Apex audit had already been completed by my agency, and that his absolute destruction was currently resting inside the leather handbag right next to my water glass. Felicity, completely oblivious to her husband's impending cardiac event, patted his arm affectionately. "Greg is just a perfectionist, Uncle Thomas. He carries the weight of the entire industry on his shoulders. That is why we are letting Hazel do her small part tonight. It takes a village to build an empire." My mother set her wine glass down with a sharp clink. "Enough socializing," she declared, her tone shifting from the forgiving matriarch to the commanding dictator. "Let us get down to business before the appetizers arrive. I want this unpleasantness handled so we can go back to enjoying our evening." Richard, my father, who had been silently watching the entire exchange, finally moved. He reached down into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how my flight was or how my business was doing. He simply acted as the cold, efficient enforcer of Beverly's will. He unclasped the envelope and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. With a swift, practiced motion, he slid the thick packet across the pristine white tablecloth, stopping exactly inches from my hands. He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and placed it deliberately on top of the paper. "This is the personal line of credit application and the direct wire transfer authorization," Richard said, his voice flat and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "It is for $350,000. We factored in an extra $50,000 to cover the inconvenience of the bank processing fees. The interest rate is standard. Greg will assume full responsibility for the payments once his buyout clears tomorrow, but the liability remains entirely in your name until then." I looked down at the documents. Even a cursory glance at the top page revealed it was a highly predatory loan agreement. The audacity of the contract was breathtaking. Richard had not just brought a standard loan application, he had brought a document that effectively signed away my entire financial independence. I could see the clauses outlining the total forfeiture of personal assets in the event of default. The interest rate was absolutely astronomical, and the terms were structured to guarantee that a single missed payment would trigger a devastating chain reaction, allowing the bank to seize any assets tied to the signer. They were not just trying to steal $350,000. They were attempting to build a legal safety net, using my flesh and bone to catch their inevitable fall. If the Apex buyout failed, and Greg's Ponzi scheme collapsed, the bank would come directly for me. My parents would walk away clean while I faced total economic ruin. They had designed a perfect legal sacrifice, and the most fascinating part was that they assumed I was still illiterate in the language of high-level finance. They still viewed me as the amateur video editor, working out of a freezing apartment, terrified of credit scores and corporate jargon. They did not see the CEO of Vanguard Digital Strategy. They only saw the scapegoat. Beverly leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her eyes were hard and completely unforgiving. "Read it quickly and sign at the bottom, Hazel. The bank manager is a personal friend of ours, and he is waiting for the scanned copy tonight so he can release the funds first thing in the morning. Do not make a fuss. Do not ask stupid questions. Just sign the paper and prove that you are actually capable of thinking about someone other than yourself for once in your life." Felicity crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the light from the chandelier above. "Yes, Hazel. Sign the paper so we can get back to celebrating with the real family members. You are incredibly lucky we even gave you this chance to redeem yourself." Sign it, Richard demanded again, tapping the table next to the silver pen. We do not have all night. The waiter will be bringing the crab cakes in a moment, and I refuse to have legal documents cluttering the table during the first course. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not touch the predatory contract. I let the silence stretch across the table, thick and suffocating, allowing the sheer hostility of their demands to settle into the air. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Miriam watched me with eager, judgmental eyes, waiting for my inevitable submission. I looked from the contract to my father. His eyes held no warmth, no regret. There was only the cold impatience of a man annoyed by a minor administrative delay. I looked at Beverly, who was already checking her reflection in her phone screen, adjusting a stray strand of hair. And finally I looked at Greg. The sweat was pooling at his collar now. The buzzing of his phone was almost audible over the ambient restaurant noise. He mouthed the word please, leaning slightly toward me, his eyes wide with a manic terror that only a man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment could possess. I smiled. It was not a smile of submission. It was a smile of absolute total control. I slowly unclasped the gold hardware of my designer bag. The sharp metallic click was swallowed by the ambient hum of the restaurant, but to me it sounded like a starting pistol. Before my fingers could grasp the heavy file waiting inside, my father leaned aggressively across the table. Richard's face was suddenly inches from mine. The cloying scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of his nervous breath. He dropped his voice so the adjacent tables of wealthy Seattle elites could not eavesdrop, but his tone was laced with absolute concentrated venom. Sign it, Hazel, he whispered, his eyes narrowing into dark, calculating slits. It is the very least you can do to make up for ruining the mood leading up to Felicity's wedding with your illness. You made her entire special year completely about your treatments and your hospital stays. You dragged the whole family down with your endless medical drama when we should have been celebrating her happiness. You owe her this. You owe us all a little cooperation. The sheer cruelty of his statement hung in the air, suspended over the white tablecloth like a toxic gas. A few years ago, those words would have shattered me completely. They would have reduced me to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess right there in the middle of the dining room. I would have snatched the pen and signed my own death warrant just to stop the barrage of emotional abuse. But the woman sitting in this chair was not the terrified cancer patient they remembered. The woman sitting in this chair had stared death in the face and won. Richard's pathetic attempt to weaponize my survival was nothing more than a desperate play by a weak man. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply stared back at him, letting the absolute emptiness of my gaze reflect his own ugliness right back into his eyes. I let my left hand rest inside my open bag, my fingertips lightly tracing the smooth leather of the dossier. I did not pull it out just yet. I wanted to stretch this moment out. I wanted to let the tension build until it choked them. I reached forward with my right hand and picked up the thick stack of predatory legal documents Richard had shoved at me. I lifted the heavy pages, holding them up to the light of the crystal chandelier, and pretended to examine the densely packed paragraphs of legalese. I scanned the text casually, marveling at the sheer audacity of the financial trap they had constructed. The terms were brutally explicit. They were asking me to secure a $350,000 personal line of credit using a variable interest rate that would skyrocket the moment the introductory period ended. The collateral clauses were completely unhinged, essentially granting the bank the right to liquidate my personal bank accounts, my business assets, and any future earnings in the event of a default. They had structured it so that Greg and Felicity had zero legal liability. The money would be wired directly to OmniStream Dynamics, but the debt would remain entirely chained to my social security number. It was financial murder printed on bright white paper. The extended family, completely ignorant of the actual terms and blinded by my parents' aggressive gaslighting, took my silence as typical stubborn submission. The coordinated murmuring began right on cue, exactly as Beverly had orchestrated. Aunt Miriam leaned toward Cousin Beatrice, speaking in a loud stage whisper designed entirely to apply social pressure. It really is so incredibly generous of Greg to let her in on the ground floor of such a booming company, she said, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace. Most tech founders keep all the early equity for themselves or reserve it for high-level venture capitalists. He is practically handing her a golden ticket to financial security. It shows how forgiving this family truly is to welcome her back after she completely isolated herself. Exactly, Beatrice chimed in, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet with an air of unearned superiority. I mean, what does Hazel even know about investing or the corporate world? She just plays around with little video files all day. Greg is giving her a chance to actually build a real portfolio. She should be crying with gratitude right now, instead of sitting there analyzing a standard contract like she actually understands what any of those words mean. Beverly is a saint for facilitating this reconciliation. Uncle Thomas chuckled loudly, slicing into his rare steak with a heavy silver knife. Well, you know how it is, Beatrice. Some people just lack the capacity for vision. They get scared of the big numbers. Greg has the vision. He is doing all the heavy lifting and taking all the real risks. All Hazel has to do is put her name on a piece of paper and ride his coattails to the top. It is the easiest money she will ever make in her life. While they blindly praised his fictitious brilliance and mocked my supposed ignorance, I watched Greg over the top of the legal documents. He was completely detached from the arrogant conversation happening around him. He was staring down at his lap where his phone was still lighting up like a maritime distress beacon. A thick, heavy drop of sweat traced a jagged path down his temple and vanished into the collar of his expensive velvet blazer. I was trembling so violently that I could actually see the fabric of his jacket vibrating near his shoulder. His creditors were circling the wagons and the jaws were snapping shut. The offshore shell accounts were bouncing his transfers. The fake click farm vendors were demanding their fraudulent payments. The private investors were threatening federal lawsuits. He was a cornered animal suffocating under the weight of his own massive deception. He needed my signature to survive the night. He needed that $350,000 injection to temporarily placate his most aggressive creditors before the Apex acquisition team dug too deep into his servers tomorrow morning. His panic was a palpable living entity at the table, radiating outward in waves of raw terror. My deliberate, agonizingly slow reading of the contract was pushing Felicity past her breaking point. She had zero capacity for patience, and my refusal to instantly submit was causing her carefully constructed mask to slip. She tapped her manicured acrylic nails against the heavy mahogany table in a rapid, irritating rhythm that echoed sharply over the gentle clinking of expensive silverware and the low hum of the upscale restaurant. Hazel, seriously! Felicity snapped, her voice rising in pitch and cutting through the ambient noise of the dining room. It is a standard personal line of credit. You do not need to read every single word like you are passing the bar exam. We are on a very tight schedule here. Greg and I have a private yacht reservation in Cabo next week that we need to finalize tonight, and I am absolutely not going to let your ridiculous need for attention hold up our travel agent. A yacht in Cabo, Aunt Miriam gasped, clapping her hands together in genuine delight. Oh, Felicity, that sounds absolutely divine. You two worked so incredibly hard. You deserve a proper luxurious getaway to celebrate the buyout. Thank you, Aunt Miriam, Felicity said, beaming with a sickeningly fake display of humility. Greg has been under so much extreme pressure finalizing this massive corporate acquisition. We just need to get this tiny family business sorted out so we can focus on the global expansion of OmniStream Dynamics. So Hazel, please stop being difficult and just sign the paper so we can order our appetizers. Beverly nodded firmly, crossing her arms over her chest. Your sister is right, Hazel. Do not ruin this evening. We are being incredibly gracious by allowing you to be part of this family again. We are overlooking your past behavior and your complete lack of support during Felicity's wedding. Sign the document. Show us that you have finally grown up and learned how to be a team player. I lowered the contract, resting it gently back onto the pristine white tablecloth directly next to Richard's cheap silver pen. I did not argue with Felicity about her phantom yacht trip. I did not yell at Aunt Miriam or Uncle Thomas for their breathtaking ignorance. I did not cry at my father's disgusting, completely inhumane comment about my illness. I remained a portrait of absolute crystalline calm, a predator perfectly still in the tall grass. I reached back into my open designer bag, bypassing the heavy encrypted dossier for just a moment. my fingers curled around the cool polished metal of my own writing instrument. I slowly withdrew a heavy custom-crafted Mont Blanc fountain pen. The solid gold trim caught the light from the massive crystal chandelier overhead, gleaming with an undeniable authority. I held the beautiful pen in my right hand, feeling its perfect solid weight resting against my palm. I rolled it slowly between my fingers, letting the entire table watch the deliberate, precise movement. But I did not lower it to their predatory contract. I allowed the heavy gold nib of my custom fountain pen to hover a mere fraction of an inch above the signature line. Richard exhaled a sharp breath of satisfaction, his trap seemingly sprung. Beverly adjusted her posture, practically preening under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied the sickly, compliant daughter into submission once again. But instead of pressing ink to the predatory contract, I smoothly capped the pen and slipped it into the breast pocket of my charcoal suit. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking like a whip across the table. "Sign the document, Hazel. We are not playing games here." I ignored him entirely. My hand dipped back into the depths of my structured Italian leather bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and closed around the thick, glossy spine of the Vanguard Digital Strategy dossier. It was heavy, dense, with the undeniable weight of absolute ruin. I pulled it out, letting the matte black cover catch the ambient light of the dining room. It was embossed with my agency's elite silver crest, catching the eyes of everyone at the table. With a deliberate, fluid motion, I dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud, sliding directly over Richard's predatory loan agreement and covering the signature line entirely. The collective confusion around the table was instantaneous and palpable. Aunt Miriam stopped mid-sip of her wine, her glass suspended in the air. Uncle Thomas frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in befuddlement. Beverly leaned back slightly, deeply insulted that her perfectly orchestrated moment of submission had been interrupted by an unauthorized prop. "What on earth is this?" Beverly hissed, treating the black folder like it was contaminated waste. "We are trying to finalize a massive financial transaction, Hazel. Put your little portfolio away. Nobody is interested in your graphic design samples tonight. We have actual business to conduct." I kept my eyes locked entirely on Greg. "What is this?" Greg echoed, his voice shaking noticeably. A fresh wave of perspiration broke across his forehead, trailing down his temples. He was staring at the silver crest on the folder, and I could see the exact moment a terrifying realization began to form behind his eyes. He recognized the quality. He recognized the corporate weight of it. I picked up my sparkling water, taking a slow, measured sip. "Just some reading material," I said, my voice carrying a smooth conversational cadence that sliced through the mounting tension. "Since you were so incredibly eager for me to invest $350,000 into your booming empire, I decided it was only prudent to have my team do a little due diligence before I signed my life away." Greg's hands hovered over the matte black cover. He was literally vibrating. "Your team," he repeated the words, barely a breath escaping his pale lips. "Go ahead, Greg," I offered, gesturing gracefully toward the folder with a sweep of my hand. "Open it. I think you will find the profit and loss projections absolutely fascinating." "Greg, ignore her," Felicity snapped, rolling her eyes in dramatic exasperation. "She is just stalling because she is terrified of real money. Hazel, just move your stupid folder and sign the papers. I already told the yacht broker we would wire the deposit for Cabo by midnight. I am not losing that reservation just because you are having an anxiety attack over a standard contract." But Greg was no longer listening to his wife. Compelled by a morbid, desperate curiosity, he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was not a design sample. It was a high-resolution, full-color printout of an outgoing wire transfer log. It documented a massive transfer of private investor capital being funneled directly out of OmniStream Dynamics and into a heavily concealed offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. Below it was a secondary log showing the exact same funds being routed right back into Greg and Felicity's joint checking account to cover the astronomical lease on their luxury loft. Greg made a soft choking sound in the back of his throat. He quickly flipped to the second page. There, glaring back at him in stark black and white, was the comprehensive server ping analysis from Vanguard Digital Strategy. It detailed the 300 fake web traffic bots, He was running out of a server farm in Eastern Europe, mathematically dismantling his claim of 300,000 daily active users. The data was raw, undeniable, and federally certified. What is he looking at? Richard demanded, leaning over to try and catch a glimpse of the pages. Greg, what did she hand you? Greg did not answer. He was completely paralyzed, violently turning the pages as his entire fraudulent existence was laid bare before him. He flipped to the third section and his breathing stopped entirely. I was staring at copies of fraudulent credit card applications. 6 of them. All bearing my name, Hazel Marie Sterling. All bearing my highly sensitive social security number. But the digital forensic watermark stamped across the bottom of the page showed the exact IP address where the applications had been initiated. It matched the router at his luxury apartment perfectly. I watched the blood drain from Greg's face with the speed of a collapsing avalanche. His skin turned a translucent, terrifying shade of chalk. His eyes, wide with pure, unadulterated panic, flicked up from the document and locked onto mine. He looked at me like he had just seen a ghost, like the quiet, submissive sister-in-law he had been mocking for years had suddenly transformed into the Grim Reaper. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. Both of his hands rested flat on top of the black cover, shaking so violently they rattled the heavy silver cutlery against the porcelain plates. Greg, what is wrong with you? Felicity demanded, her voice shrill and embarrassed by his sudden display of absolute terror. Why are you acting like this? Just push her garbage out of the way and give her the pen. We are making a scene. You! Greg stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. You, how did you? This is a federal crime, I provided, smoothly finishing his broken sentence. Yes, Greg. Several of them, actually. Wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, falsifying corporate documents to secure private equity. It is a remarkably long list. You have been very busy while I was busy surviving cancer. Beverly slammed her hand flat against the table. Hazel, I have had absolutely enough of this ridiculous behavior. Stop attacking Greg immediately. You are just jealous of his success and you are trying to ruin a beautiful evening. Success? I laughed, a genuine cold sound that startled my mother into silence. Mother, there is no success. There is no booming corporate empire. OmniStream Dynamics is a hollow, empty shell. Greg has been running a massive Ponzi scheme for the last 2 years, stealing millions of dollars from private investors to fund Felicity's designer wardrobe and their fancy cars. There is no software. There are no users. It is all completely, entirely fake. Aunt Miriam gasped, clutching her pearl necklace in absolute horror. Uncle Thomas dropped his steak knife, the heavy silver clattering loudly against his plate. Cousin Beatrice let out a small, sharp squeak of disbelief. That is an outrageous lie, Richard bellowed, his face turning a deep, mottled purple with rage. Greg is waiting on a buyout from Apex Investment Group tomorrow morning. He is about to be a multimillionaire. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, perfectly mirroring Beverly's earlier posture, but radiating pure, lethal intent. That is the most beautiful part of this entire evening, Richard, I said, locking eyes with my father. Greg is indeed pitching a buyout to Apex tomorrow. What he does not know is that Apex hired an elite forensic digital auditing firm to tear through his servers before they signed the paperwork. They found massive financial irregularities and demanded a full criminal audit to protect their own assets. Greg looked like he was going to vomit right there onto the pristine white tablecloth. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to anchor himself to a reality that no longer existed. And do you know the name of the firm they hired, Greg? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register that demanded the attention of every single person at the table. Do you know who owns the company that just completely dismantled your entire pathetic life? I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card, sliding it across the table until it rested against his shaking hands. He stared down at the embossed silver lettering. Vanguard Digital Strategy. Hazel Marie Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. I am the auditor, Greg. I whispered, the absolute devastation of my words hitting him like physical blows. I am the one who traced the wire transfers. I am the one who found the offshore accounts. And I am the one who recovered the deleted email threads where my loving sister explicitly told you to steal my social security number while I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life. Felicity's jaw dropped open. Her carefully applied designer blush could not hide the sudden terrifying pallor that washed over her face. You hacked my emails, she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I recovered corporate data under federal subpoena power during an authorized corporate audit. I corrected smoothly, my tone devoid of any mercy. Everything in that folder is completely admissible in court. The cage is locked, Felicity. There is absolutely nowhere left for you to run. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping of the wooden legs against the marble floor sounded like a sharp intake of breath. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a vacuum, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence of our table. I smoothed the lapels of my immaculate charcoal suit, adjusting my cuffs with deliberate precision. For 35 years, I had slouched in my chair, making myself small, folding my body inward, to take up less space in a family that viewed my existence as an inconvenient footnote. I had absorbed their sneers, their passive-aggressive pity, their endless comparisons. I did not slouch now. I stood to my full height, squaring my shoulders and radiating absolute unbreakable power. I looked down at the people who had treated me like a pathetic charity case for my entire life, and I prepared to burn their kingdom to the ground. You spent years telling me I was a failure with a hobby. I said, my voice carrying a quiet but razor-sharp resonance that commanded the attention of everyone within earshot. You mocked me for sitting in a freezing apartment stitching together timelines on Final Cut and scraping by on cheap assets from Storyblocks while you flaunted your leased luxury cars and your borrowed wealth. You told the entire extended family that I was a lost cause hiding behind a medical tragedy. But my little hobby did not just pay the rent. It evolved. It scaled. It grew into a multi-million-dollar digital strategy firm, a firm that specializes in tearing apart the digital footprints of tech startups. A firm that was specifically contracted by federal liquidators to conduct a deep forensic audit of Greg's crumbling fraudulent company before Apex Investment Group flushed their capital down the toilet. The shockwave that rippled through the table was immediate and visceral. Aunt Miriam let out a sharp, audible gasp, raising a manicured hand to her mouth, as if to catch the scandalized words spilling from her lips. Uncle Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his eyes darting frantically between me and Greg, waiting for the tech prodigy to laugh off the accusation. Cousin Beatrice sat frozen, her mouth forming a perfect silent circle of horror, her wineglass forgotten in her trembling hand. But Beverly reacted exactly as she had been programmed to react by a lifetime of protecting her golden child. She slammed both hands onto the table, making the heavy silverware jump and clatter against the fine porcelain plates. "That is an absolute ridiculous lie!" Beverly shrieked, her carefully maintained country club composure fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face twisted with indignant rage. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying, Thomas. This is exactly what she does. She is a jealous, bitter broke video editor who cannot stand to see her sister succeed. She has been trying to ruin Felicity's happiness since the day she was born. She is making up this absurd fantasy because she is desperate for attention." My father, Richard, joined the desperate defense, his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "Hazel, you have crossed a line that you cannot uncross," he snarled, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You think you can walk into a five-star restaurant wearing a rented suit and spin some ridiculous corporate fairy tale. You expect us to believe that you, a girl who could not even pay for her own medical bills without ruining our credit, are somehow a high-powered federal auditor. It is pathetic. You are completely pathetic. Hand over the folder and leave before I have the maitre d' throw you out onto the street." I did not look at my father. I kept my eyes locked on Beverly, tapping the glossy black cover of the Vanguard dossier with one manicured finger. The sharp tapping sound echoed like a metronome counting down the final seconds of their false reality. "It is all in there, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial deadpan calm. I gestured toward Greg. "Open it, see for yourself." With trembling hands, Greg slowly pulled the heavy cover back. His eyes locked onto the first page. It was a high-resolution full-color printout of an outgoing wire transfer log detailing his massive embezzlement into offshore shell accounts. He swallowed hard, flipping to the next page. There, glaring back at him, were the fraudulent credit card applications bearing my name and my social security number, but stamped with the undeniable digital forensic watermark showing his exact IP address. Greg's face drained of all color, instantly turning the shade of old parchment. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Both of his hands rested flat on top of the black cover, shaking so violently they rattled the heavy silver cutlery against the table. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with pure unadulterated panic, like he had just seen a ghost. Every single dirty secret is printed in high resolution. I continued seamlessly, addressing the horrified table, the fake user accounts, the stolen private equity money, the rampant identity theft. Greg is not a tech visionary. He is completely bankrupt. He is a criminal who used offshore click farms to fabricate his company metrics so he could con Apex Investment Group into a massive buyout. And when the venture capital money ran dry and the creditors started closing in, he did not just take out loans in his own name, he needed a clean credit profile to burn. I paused, letting the terrible weight of my next words hang in the heavy air above the table. Felicity helped him forge my signature. I stated clearly, articulating each syllable so there could be no misunderstanding from anyone in the audience. Your golden daughter, the perfect bride who was so terribly inconvenienced by my cancer treatments, actively participated in a federal crime. She used my medical history as an excuse to steal my identity. She convinced Greg to take out maximum lines of credit under my social security number because she figured I would be dead soon anyway, or at the very least renting an apartment for the rest of my miserable life. That is who you are defending, Mom. You are defending a pair of sociopathic con artists who tried to use my name as a financial shield to protect their luxury lifestyle and pay for their phantom yachts in Cabo. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb dropping, of a carefully curated illusion, shattering into dust right before their eyes. Uncle Thomas turned to look at Greg, his face a mask of disgusted realization. Greg was completely unresponsive. He had shrunk back into his chair, his eyes glazed over with a hollow, vacant stare, as he realized that the federal prison sentence was no longer a possibility, but an inescapable certainty. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his panic-constricted lungs. Aunt Miriam looked at Felicity, her expression morphing from admiration to sheer revulsion. You stole your own sister's identity. Miriam whispered, the scandalized words cutting through the tension like a physical blade. While she was fighting for her life in a hospital ward, you stole her credit to buy designer clothes. You are a monster. Beverly opened her mouth to speak, to formulate another lie, another defense, another way to blame me for exposing the rot at the core of our family. She looked from me to the thick black dossier, and then at Greg's sweating, terrified face. The undeniable reality of the situation was finally penetrating her decades of denial. There was no tech buyout. There was no immense wealth. There was only massive, crippling debt and impending criminal charges that would drag their precious social standing through the mud. But her pride refused to let her admit defeat. She clamped her mouth shut, her eyes burning with a venomous, hateful glare. Then the dam finally broke. Felicity could not maintain the facade for another second. The elegant, composed bride, the woman who demanded perfection and luxury at every turn, completely snapped. The realization that her wealthy extended family was currently watching her unmasking drove her into a state of feral panic. She jumped up from the table with a violent suddenness. The back of her legs caught the heavy mahogany chair, sending it crashing backward onto the marble floor with a deafening bang. Several tables nearby went dead silent as wealthy diners turned to stare at the commotion. Waiters froze in their tracks, carrying trays of expensive food. She is lying. Felicity screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the towering glass walls of the restaurant. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged malice, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly into her eyes. She fabricated all of it. Every single page in that stupid black folder is a fake. She jabbed a shaking, manicured finger in my direction, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. You printed all of this garbage out of pure spite, Hazel. You have always hated me. You hated that I got the beautiful wedding and the rich husband while you were sick and pathetic and completely alone. You are making up this entire investigation just to ruin my life because you are bitter that you missed my wedding. You forged these documents to get back at me. You are crazy. You are absolutely insane. I watched Felicity unravel. Her shrill voice shattered the refined acoustics of the dining room, bouncing off the imported glass panels and silencing the soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers. The elite patrons of the restaurant, wealthy venture capitalists, tech executives, and socialites, froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. Waiters in crisp black uniforms stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide as they watched the immaculate bride throw a spectacular public tantrum. Felicity kicked her fallen chair out of the way, her chest heaving as she pointed a trembling manicured finger at my face. She looked unhinged, entirely stripped of the polished, wealthy facade she had spent years cultivating. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not shout. You can scream that I am insane until your vocal cords bleed. Felicity. I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal resonance that cut effortlessly through her hysteria. But the federal liquidators do not care about your wedding. They do not care about your yacht reservations in Cabo. They only care about the digital paper trail, and unfortunately for you, your husband was incredibly sloppy. You both were. Richard slammed his open palm against the table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. That is enough, he roared, his face a mask of furious denial. I will not sit here and listen to you slander your sister and your brother-in-law. Greg is a visionary. He is building a legacy. You are just a bitter, vindictive girl trying to ruin a celebratory dinner because you could not stand being left out of the spotlight. I am calling the manager. I am having you removed from this establishment immediately. He half rose from his seat, his chair scraping harshly against the polished marble floor. He was fully prepared to grab me by the arm and drag me out into the rainy Seattle night, just to preserve his precious illusion of the Golden family. I kept my eyes locked on him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly on the glossy black cover of the Vanguard dossier. I slowly opened the heavy folder, bypassing the first 41 pages of corporate embezzlement and identity theft. I turned directly to page 42. I unclipped the single sheet of thick, high-quality paper from the binding. With a smooth, deliberate flick of my wrist, I slid the document across the white tablecloth. It glided silently, coming to a perfect stop directly between Richard and Beverly. Before you call security, Dad, I suggest you read that, I said, my tone dropping to a sub-zero chill. Read it very carefully, because while you have been sitting here defending the golden couple and calling me a bitter failure, you might want to know exactly how Greg kept his fraudulent company afloat for the last 6 months after the private equity money dried up. Richard paused, his hand hovering over his napkin. He looked from my cold face to the document resting on the table. The absolute certainty in my voice finally managed to pierce through his towering arrogance. He slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes darting toward the paper. Beverly, leaning in close to him, frowned deeply, her perfectly painted lips pressing into a tight line of suspicion. What is this garbage? Hazel Beverly demanded, though her voice lacked its usual commanding sting. What are you trying to show us? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. That is a comprehensive, certified breakdown of your personal financial portfolio, I explained cleanly. Specifically, it is a detailed ledger showing the complete liquidation of your primary retirement accounts, alongside the default notices for the secondary mortgage on your estate. The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. Richard froze. His hand snapped down onto the document, pulling it closer to his face. His eyes scanned the top of the page, reading the official bank letterheads and the certified forensic stamps from Vanguard Digital Strategy. You see, Mom, I continued, my voice echoing in the deafening silence of our table. Greg needed bridge capital to keep the Click Farms running, so he could fake his user metrics for the Apex Investment Group. He needed millions to maintain the illusion of a booming tech company. He maxed out his own credit, and then he maxed out mine through Felicity's identity theft. But even that was not enough to cover the massive hole in his servers. So he turned to his biggest supporters. He turned to the people who trusted him implicitly. Richard's hands began to shake. The thick paper rattled in his grip. His eyes flew across the columns of numbers tracing the massive unauthorized withdrawals from the retirement accounts he had spent 40 years building. He saw the dates of the transfers perfectly aligning with the times Greg had claimed to be helping them optimize their financial portfolios for better tax returns. Greg convinced you to give him administrative access to your investment portals to set up a blind trust, Beverly, I said, watching the exact moment. My mother's eyes widened in absolute horror as she read the numbers over my father's shoulder. He told you he was rolling your assets into a high-yield corporate bond tied to OmniStream Dynamics. But there was no bond. There was no trust. He simply drained your retirement accounts dry and funneled every single penny into his offshore shell companies to pay off his furious fake vendors. Beverly let out a strangled, gasping sound. She grabbed the edge of the paper, pulling it from Richard's hands to stare at the bottom line. The final balance of their life savings was printed in stark, undeniable black ink. 0. And the house, I added, twisting the knife with surgical precision. When your retirement funds ran out, Greg used the administrative access you blindly handed him to forge a power of attorney. He took out a massive secondary mortgage against your estate. A highly predatory loan with terms almost as vicious as the one you tried to force me to sign tonight. The first 3 payments were missed. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. Greg intercepted the physical mail and routed the digital warnings to a dead server. You are completely bankrupt. You do not own your home anymore. You own absolutely nothing. The realization hit the table with the destructive force of a meteor. The unbreakable united front of the perfect family shattered instantly, fracturing into a million jagged pieces of greed and betrayal. The illusion of wealth, the country club status, the smug superiority, it all incinerated in a fraction of a second. Beverly let out a primal, ear-piercing shriek that did not belong in a 5-star restaurant. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire identity burn to ash. She lunged across the table, her perfectly manicured hands transforming into claws. She completely ignored Greg and aimed straight for the daughter she had worshipped her entire life. She grabbed a fistful of Felicity's silk designer gown, ripping the delicate fabric near the shoulder. "You stole it!" Beverly screamed, her face contorted with a terrifying feral rage, spit flying from her lips as she shook her golden child violently. "You let him steal our money. You took our house. You took everything we have. We gave you the world and you robbed us blind so you could play rich on a yacht." Felicity stumbled backward, trying to swat her mother's hands away, her own face twisted in panic and sudden defensive fury. "Get off of me, Mom. I did not know he was taking the house. He told me he was just borrowing the retirement money for a few weeks until the buyout cleared. We were going to pay you back tomorrow." Richard did not waste his breath screaming at his daughter. The stoic, cold patriarch who had spent the entire evening insulting my existence turned into an absolute monster. He threw his chair back and lunged at Greg. He grabbed the tech founder by the thick velvet collar of his blazer, hauling him halfway out of his seat. Greg choked, letting out a pathetic wheezing sound as Richard slammed him back against the heavy mahogany chair. "I will kill you!" Richard roared, his voice booming across the dining room, entirely abandoning any pretense of upper-class civility. "You stole my life savings. You parasitic lying fraud. I will tear you apart with my bare hands. I will see you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life." Greg threw his hands up in a desperate attempt to protect his face, weeping openly. "Richard, please," he begged, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "It was a bridge loan. I can fix it. Apex is buying us out. I can make you whole. Just let me close the deal tomorrow." "There is no deal, you idiot!" Uncle Thomas shouted, jumping up from his chair and backing away from the table as if the entire family had suddenly contracted a lethal virus. His booming voice carried the ultimate condemnation. "She just told you the auditors are federal liquidators. Apex is not buying your garbage company. They are turning you over to the FBI. You are going to prison." Aunt Miriam grabbed Cousin Beatrice by the arm, pulling her away from the table, her face pale with absolute disgust. "Thomas, get us out of here," Aunt Miriam demanded, shooting a look of pure revulsion at Beverly and Richard. "I will not be associated with this trash. They are bankrupt criminals." The center of the dining room had devolved into a vicious public brawl. Beverly was openly slapping Felicity across the arms and chest, sobbing hysterically about country club dues and public humiliation. Felicity was screaming back, crying that her parents owed her the money for ruining her wedding year with their stress. Richard was shaking Greg so hard the tech founder's head snapped back and forth, his flashy watch flying off his wrist and shattering against the marble floor. I remained seated at the very edge of the table, perfectly still, completely untouched by the carnage unfolding inches away from me. I picked up my water glass and took another slow sip, watching the Golden family tear each other to bloody shreds. The heavy oak doors leading to the kitchen swung open violently. The restaurant manager, a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit, marched purposefully across the dining room floor, flanked by three broad-shouldered security guards. His face was set in a mask of professional outrage, determined to shut down the physical altercation immediately. As the security guards rushed forward to pry Richard off the weeping tech founder and separate Beverly from her screaming daughter, the sheer reality of the situation finally slammed into my mother. The adrenaline of the physical fight faded, replaced by the cold, horrifying truth of her absolute destitution. Beverly stumbled back from Felicity, her chest heaving, her designer dress rumpled and askew. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the shocked faces of the wealthy patrons, the disgust of her extended family fleeing the scene, and the harsh grip of the security guards restraining her husband. She had no money. She had no house. She had no country club, no status, and no golden son-in-law to save her. Slowly, Beverly turned her head. Her wild, tear-streaked eyes tracked across the chaotic table, past the overturned chairs and the spilled wine, until they locked onto me. I was sitting there in my immaculate designer suit, holding the power of a multi-million-dollar firm, calmly watching her world end. In that singular, suspended moment, the horrifying realization dawned perfectly on my mother's face. She was completely penniless, and the daughter she had relentlessly abused, mocked, and discarded was a titan of industry. I was the only person left on earth with the power and the capital to save her from living on the street. And as she stared into my cold, unyielding eyes, she knew with absolute terrifying certainty that I was not going to give her a single dime. I simply smiled, set my glass down, and waited for her to speak. Beverly's hands were shaking so violently that her diamond tennis bracelet rattled against her wrist. She reached across the ruined table, her perfectly manicured fingers clamped around my forearm like a vice. Tears, thick and black with ruined mascara, streamed down her cheeks, cutting jagged paths through her heavy layers of expensive foundation. The aristocratic matriarch of the Sterling family, the woman who had spent 35 years ensuring I knew my exact subservient place in her kingdom, was completely gone. In her place sat a terrified, begging woman, staring directly down the barrel of absolute poverty. Hazel Beverly gasped, her voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob that echoed in the silent dining room. "Hazel, please, you have to fix this." I looked down at her hand, gripping my jacket. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until the sheer coldness of my gaze forced her to loosen her grip. She pulled her hand back, wiping her face frantically, but the desperation remained, a suffocating aura that clung to her. "You heard what Thomas said," Beverly pleaded, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo. "You have millions. You own this Vanguard company. You have the power to make this entire nightmare go away. You have to pay off the house, Hazel. If the bank forecloses on Tuesday, we will have nowhere to go. We will lose our membership at the club. We will lose everything. Your father and I are too old to start over. You have the money. Just write a check and clear the mortgage. Please, you have to save us." Her desperation was palpable, but she was entirely oblivious to the staggering irony of her demand. Less than 30 minutes ago, she had been ordering me to sign away my meager life savings to fund Greg's fraudulent empire. She had called me a failure, a jealous spinster, a broke video editor. Now she was begging for my wealth to save her from the consequences of her own blind favoritism. I slowly extracted my arm from her reach, smoothing the sleeve of my charcoal suit. "I do not have to do anything, Mom," I said, my voice as smooth and unyielding as polished glass. "I did not take out a secondary mortgage on the family estate. I did not hand over administrative access to my retirement accounts to a con artist. Those were your choices. You gambled your entire financial existence on Greg because he drove a leased Porsche and wore a flashy watch. You made your bed. Now you get to sleep in it. Richard, still breathing heavily from his violent outburst, turned his furious gaze toward me. She is your mother, he bellowed, his voice hoarse and commanding. We raised you. We gave you everything. You cannot just sit there and watch us lose our home when you have the power to stop it. You owe this family. Before I could dismantle my father's absurd claim, Felicity shoved her way past a bewildered security guard. The delicate tear in her designer gown hung loosely off her shoulder, but her arrogance remained entirely intact. The terror of her impending ruin had mutated into a toxic, blinding sense of entitlement. She slammed her hands onto the table, leaning into my personal space, her eyes wide with manic audacity. Dad is right! Felicity shrieked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a rusty blade. You owe us, Hazel. You owe me. I raised a single eyebrow, staring at my sister, as if she were an exotic, particularly repulsive insect. I owe you, I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the air. Yes, Felicity spat, her face twisting with venom. Do you have any idea what you put this family through? Do you know how much of a massive burden you were? While I was trying to plan the most important day of my life, you were busy losing your hair and throwing up in a hospital room. You ruined my entire wedding year with your pathetic cancer treatments. Mom and Dad had to spend thousands of dollars on your medical bills instead of upgrading my floral arrangements. We suffered because of you. So yes, you owe us. She gestured wildly toward Greg, who was still slumped in his chair, weeping into his hands like a broken child. Greg just made a mistake, she continued, her logic completely detached from reality. He was trying to provide for me the way I deserve. You are going to write a check to Apex Investment Group and clear Greg's debts right now. You are going to pay off the house, and you are going to drop this entire fake audit. You have millions of dollars that you do not even need. You are just a boring, lonely workaholic. Give us the money, Hazel. Hand it over. I sat perfectly still. The sheer, unadulterated toxicity radiating from my sister was breathtaking. I looked at Felicity, then at Beverly, who was nodding along with her golden daughter's deranged demands, and finally at Richard, who stood with his arms crossed, expecting my immediate compliance. They actually believed it. They truly believed that my survival was an inconvenience, that my success was their property, and that my money existed solely to subsidize their delusions of grandeur. I looked down at the people who had left me to face chemotherapy entirely alone. I remembered the endless sterile nights in the oncology ward, the sickening smell of antiseptic, the bone-deep exhaustion that made simply breathing feel like running a marathon. I remembered holding my own hand while the poison dripped into my veins because Beverly was too busy attending Felicity's cake-tasting appointments to visit. I remembered Richard telling me to stop being so dramatic when I asked for a small loan to pay for my anti-nausea medication. I remembered Felicity complaining that my pale, sickly appearance would ruin the aesthetic of her bridal shower photos. They had abandoned me when I was dying. They had stolen my identity, my credit, and my safety net while I was fighting for my life, all to fund a destination wedding and a fraudulent lifestyle. And now, standing in the absolute wreckage of their own making, they had the monumental gall to reach out and try to steal from me again. I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to wait on my every movement. I picked up the Vanguard dossier, tapped the edges neatly against the table to align the thick papers, and slipped it seamlessly back into my structured leather bag. Let me make something perfectly clear, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register that forced them to lean in to hear me. I do not owe you a single dime. I paid every cent of my medical bills myself, working freelance editing jobs from a hospital bed while the chemotherapy ravaged my body. You did not contribute a single dollar to my survival. You contributed nothing but stress, endless criticism, and complete neglect. I turned my unyielding gaze to Felicity, who shrank back slightly under the absolute zero temperature of my stare. You stole my social security number, Felicity. You committed felony identity theft to fund a lifestyle you could never afford. You used my cancer as a convenient distraction while you and your husband drained every ounce of equity from this family. You are not a victim. You are a criminal. And Greg did not make a mistake. He executed a calculated multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that has now completely imploded. I am not writing a check to cover your felonies. I am not saving the house. I am going to watch the bank lock the doors, and I am going to sleep perfectly well tonight, knowing I had absolutely nothing to do with it. You cannot do this, Beverly sobbed, grabbing at the air where my arm had just been. Hazel, we are your family. Blood is blood. Blood is a biological accident, I countered smoothly. Family is supposed to mean loyalty. Family is supposed to mean showing up. The people at Vanguard who helped me build my company, while I was recovering, the nurses who held my hair back when I was violently ill, the friends who brought me groceries when I could not stand. That is my family. You are just a group of strangers who happen to share my last name and possess a terrifying sense of entitlement. Richard's face contorted with unbridled rage. You will regret this, he threatened, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. When the dust settles, you will be completely alone. No one will want anything to do with a daughter who destroys her own parents. The dust has already settled. Richard Y replied deliberately, using his first name to sever the final lingering tie between us. And the only ones destroyed here are the ones who handed the matches and the gasoline to a con artist. You wanted a booming tech empire. You wanted the elevated status of a millionaire son-in-law. You wanted it so badly, you ignored every red flag, every lie, and every financial inconsistency. You willingly signed the power of attorney. You handed Greg the keys to your retirement. Do not blame me for exposing the fire you started. Felicity let out a frustrated, guttural scream, stomping her expensive designer heel against the marble floor. I am calling the police, she threatened, pulling her phone from her glittering clutch. I am going to tell them you are harassing us and forging federal documents. You are going to be arrested, Hazel. I actually smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that made Felicity hesitate, her thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen of her phone. You do not need to call the police, Felicity. I said, my voice completely serene and devoid of panic. Apex Investment Group already took care of that. Greg let out a loud, pathetic whimper, burying his face deeper into his shaking hands. His shoulders heaved violently as the catastrophic reality of my words washed over him. The restaurant manager, who had been standing a few feet away with the security guards trying to maintain order, suddenly looked toward the heavy glass doors at the front of the establishment. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, looking at the 4 people who had made my life a living hell for 3 decades. They were broken, terrified, and utterly defeated. The grand illusion of the Sterling family was entirely dead, and I was the one walking away with the empire. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said, my tone impeccably polite. Though I suspect the dessert course will be slightly delayed. I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I strode across the marble floor with my head held high, the power of my presence parting the crowd of shocked diners and hovering waitstaff. The air outside the restaurant was crisp and clean, smelling of fresh rain and absolute freedom. And faintly echoing over the sounds of the chaotic dining room behind me, the distinct piercing wail of police sirens could be heard rapidly approaching the street outside the restaurant. The wail of the sirens sliced through the heavy glass windows of the restaurant, growing louder with every passing second. The sound acted like a violent electrical shock to Greg's paralyzed nervous system. His head snapped up from his hands, his eyes wide and dilated with the primal, panicked realization of a cornered animal. The federal prison sentence I had just promised him was no longer a theoretical threat hanging in the air. It was physically rolling down the street, screaming its arrival to the entire city. Greg did not look at his wife. He did not look at my father, who was still standing over him with his fists clenched. The facade of the brilliant, untouchable tech visionary completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate coward. He scrambled backward, kicking his heavy dining chair away with a violent shove. The chair slammed into Felicity, striking her directly in the knees. She let out a sharp cry of pain, tumbling awkwardly into Richard's side as Greg bolted. He did not aim for the main entrance where the sirens were converging. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the discreet illuminated exit sign near the restaurant's towering glass-enclosed wine cellar. He lunged forward, his arms pumping wildly, but his expensive leather loafers had absolutely zero traction on the immaculate polished marble floor. He slipped, his arms windmilling in the air as he desperately tried to regain his balance. He careened, completely out of control, toward a neighboring table occupied by 4 wealthy executives. Greg crashed into them with the force of a derailed freight train. The impact was deafening. He slammed directly into the edge of their table, flipping it completely over. A spectacular rain of destruction showered across the dining room. Crystal champagne flutes shattered into thousands of glittering fragments. Silver ice buckets crashed onto the marble, sending cubes of ice skittering in every direction. Expensive cuts of steak and pools of dark red wine splattered across the pristine floor, and the executives' expensive suits. The patrons screamed, scrambling backward to avoid the chaos. Greg went down hard, landing squarely on his hands and knees amid the broken glass and ruined food. He let out a pathetic guttural sob as a jagged piece of crystal sliced into the palm of his hand, leaving a bright trail of blood on the white marble. But the sheer terror of the approaching sirens drove him forward. He tried to scramble away on all fours, slipping in the spilled wine, dragging his bespoke suit through the absolute wreckage of his own making. He looked like a rat trapped in a sinking ship, desperately clawing for a way out. I stood perfectly still near the front foyer, watching his humiliating display of cowardice with total, absolute apathy. The maitre d' and two waitstaff had already rushed forward, forming a barricade near the wine cellar exit and cutting off Greg's only path of escape. He was trapped, bleeding and weeping, on the floor of a five-star restaurant, while the entire elite establishment stared at him in unadulterated disgust. I turned away from the pathetic spectacle and approached the coat check. The young attendant was staring past me, his eyes wide as saucers, completely paralyzed by the violence erupting in the dining room. I tapped my claim ticket lightly against the marble counter. He blinked rapidly, shaking himself out of his stupor, and hurried to retrieve my tailored trench coat. As I slipped my arms into the heavy, expensive fabric, I heard the frantic slapping of footsteps rushing across the foyer. Hazel, wait. Beverly collided with my shoulder, her momentum nearly sending her crashing into the coat check counter. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with desperate, ragged gasps. The aristocratic matriarch of the Sterling family, the woman who had terrorized me for 35 years, was utterly unrecognizable. Her immaculate hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with wine from when she had lunged at Felicity. Her face was a horrific mask of pure, suffocating panic. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her nails digging painfully through the thick fabric of my coat. Hazel, please. Beverly begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. She shook my arm violently, desperately trying to force me to look at her. What are you doing? You cannot just leave us here. The bank is going to take the house on Tuesday. They are going to take everything. I stared down at her, trembling fingers gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away immediately. I wanted her to feel the absolute coldness radiating from my posture. I wanted her to understand that the power dynamic had permanently, completely shifted. You have to fix this! Beverly cried, hot tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her ruined foundation. You have millions of dollars. You own that company. You have the power to stop this. You have to pay off the house so we do not end up on the street. You are my daughter. You have to save this family. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her demand hung in the air between us. She had just spent the entire dinner calling me a failure, mocking my career, and demanding I hand over my life savings to fund her fraudulent son-in-law. She had looked the other way, while Felicity stole my identity. She had abandoned me when I was dying in a hospital bed. And now, standing in the ashes of her own phenomenal greed, she still expected me to play the role of the compliant, submissive servant. She still believed that my sole purpose on this earth was to sacrifice my own well-being to subsidize her vanity. Before I could completely dismantle her delusion, Felicity stumbled into the foyer. She was limping slightly from where Greg had slammed the chair into her knees. Her bridal glow was gone, entirely replaced by a feral, venomous rage. Do not beg her, Mom! Felicity shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the high ceilings of the lobby. She pointed a trembling finger at my face, her eyes burning with pure malice. You owe us this money, Hazel. You owe us. Do you have any idea how much of a burden you were? You ruined my wedding year with your pathetic cancer treatments. We had to suffer through your endless complaining while I was trying to plan the most important day of my life. You owe us for putting up with you. Hand over the money and clear Greg's debts right now. I looked down at the two women standing before me. I looked at the mother who had left me to face chemotherapy entirely alone because she found hospital lighting depressing. I looked at the sister who had stolen my safety net to buy a destination wedding, and who now, even as her husband bled on the restaurant floor, demanded that I empty my bank accounts to save her lifestyle. They were not family. They were parasites who had finally run out of hosts. I raised my hand and slowly, deliberately peeled Beverly's fingers off my sleeve one by one. She let out a small, pathetic gasp as I pushed her hand away. I smoothed the lapel of my designer coat, ensuring the fabric fell perfectly into place. I looked dead into my mother's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I offered her only the terrifying void of absolute indifference. "I already called the police," I said. The 5 words dropped between us like an executioner's blade. Beverly's jaw went slack, her eyes widening so far I could see the white all the way around her irises. Felicity froze mid-scream, the breath catching painfully in her throat. The desperate, demanding fire in their eyes was instantly extinguished, completely replaced by the paralyzing realization of their own doom. The exact moment the words left my lips, the ambiance of the restaurant was violently interrupted. A barrage of blinding red and blue strobe lights suddenly washed over the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the establishment. The harsh, rotating neon colors cut through the dim, romantic lighting of the dining room painting. Beverly's and Felicity's terrified faces in alternating flashes of crimson and ice blue. The sirens cut off with a sharp, definitive chirp, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Through the glass I watched as 4 black, unmarked SUVs slammed to a halt directly at the curb, blocking the valet lane entirely. 3 local police cruisers boxed them in their light bars, casting a violent, frantic glow over the wet pavement. Beverly let out a low, whimpering sound, taking a stumbling step backward, as the heavy oak front doors of the restaurant were pushed open with absolute, overwhelming authority. A dozen men and women in dark windbreakers poured into the foyer. The bold yellow lettering across their backs spelled out federal acronyms that commanded instant total compliance. They moved with precise, synchronized efficiency, pushing past the horrified valet staff and stepping directly into the main dining room. Leading the pack was a sharp-eyed federal investigator. He was holding a thick stack of printed documents. They were not standard inquiries. They were aggressive, sweeping federal warrants. Warrants that I had personally expedited through Vanguard's elite corporate legal team at exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon. I had weaponized the entire legal apparatus of my firm to ensure that the moment the trap was sprung, the cage doors would instantly slam shut. The investigator did not pause to ask for the manager. His eyes swept the chaotic dining room, scanning the overturned tables, the shattered crystal, and the horrified patrons, until he locked onto his target. Greg was still on the floor, clutching his bleeding hand, leaving crimson smears on the white marble as he desperately tried to crawl toward the kitchen service doors. The heavy, authoritative boots of the federal agents slapped against the marble floor as they marched directly toward him, ignoring Richard's pale, terrified face and the absolute ruin of the Sterling family legacy. The lead federal agent did not slow his stride as he reached the center of the dining room. He did not offer a hand to help Greg up from the floor. He simply reached down, grabbed the ruined lapel of Greg's bespoke suit jacket, and hauled the weeping tech founder to his feet with brutal mechanical efficiency. Greg let out a wet, pathetic gasp, his legs completely giving out beneath him, forcing 2 other agents to prop him up by his armpits. "Gregory Vance, you are under federal arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of federal authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg did not exercise his right to remain silent. He began to babble incoherently, sobbing about bridge loans and misunderstandings, and begging the agents to let him call his investors. His face was smeared with his own blood and tears, his formerly immaculate hair sticking up in wild, disheveled tufts. The agents ignored his pathetic rambling completely. The cold, sharp sound of steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the quiet restaurant like a final definitive gavel strike. Across the ruined table, Two female agents broke off from the main group and flanked Felicity. Felicity took a stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. She held her hands up defensively, the torn shoulder of her designer gown sliding further down her arm. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "I am a victim here. I am his wife. I did not know what he was doing. You cannot arrest me. I have a reservation in Cabo." "Felicity Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud and identity theft," the taller agent stated, her tone entirely unimpressed by the frantic display of wealth and privilege. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "I will not!" Felicity screamed, slapping wildly at the agent's outstretched hands. "Do you know who I am? You cannot do this to me." "Thomas, tell them. Tell them who we are." She turned her wild, ruined face toward her wealthy uncle, desperately seeking the safety net of her family name. But Uncle Thomas did not step forward to defend her. He took a deliberate, purposeful step backward, his face a mask of absolute revulsion. He looked at Felicity as if she were a carrier of a lethal plague. Aunt Miriam actually turned her back, shielding Cousin Beatrice from the humiliating spectacle entirely. Felicity's manicured hands clawed at the air as the agents swiftly grabbed her wrists. She fought them, twisting and thrashing like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum, but her resistance was completely futile. The agents yanked her arms behind her back with practiced force, causing the delicate silk of her gown to tear even further, exposing the expensive shapewear beneath. The metal cuffs ratcheted tightly over her wrists, pinning her arms securely. "Get off of me!" Felicity wailed, her legs buckling, as the reality of the situation finally breached her narcissistic delusion. Her knees hit the marble floor, and she slumped forward, sobbing hysterically. Thick black streams of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, completely ruining her flawless bridal aesthetic. The public humiliation was absolute and absolute. The dining room of the five-star restaurant was packed with Seattle's elite wealthy venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and socialites. Every single one of them was watching the destruction of the golden couple. I saw the distinct flash of smartphone cameras from the neighboring tables. Wealthy patrons were recording the entire pathetic scene, documenting the exact moment Felicity and Greg Vance fell from their imaginary pedestal straight into the gutter. Felicity's perfect, carefully curated social media image was permanently destroyed in front of a live audience. I remained standing near the foyer, watching the arrest with a cold, detached satisfaction. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp sensation of a tumor finally being excised from my life. The lead investigator turned away from the sobbing suspects and walked deliberately toward me, the chaos of the arrests. The shouting and the crying seemed to part around him. He stopped 2 feet away, taking in my calm posture and my immaculate charcoal suit. There was a stark, distinct contrast between my absolute composure and the shattered, weeping criminals on the floor. "Ms. Sterling," the investigator said, his voice dropping to a respectful, professional volume. "We received the expedited injunctions from your legal team 10 minutes ago. Your forensic accountants were incredibly thorough. The federal asset freeze on all accounts associated with OmniStream Dynamics and the Vance household went into effect the moment we walked through those doors." I nodded, acknowledging his words. I reached into my structured leather bag and pulled out the heavy matte black Vanguard dossier. I held it out to him. "This is the hard copy of the final audit report," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "It contains the certified server logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the IP addresses matching the fraudulent credit applications to their home network. Everything is time-stamped and federally certified." The investigator took the heavy, glossy folder from my hands. He looked down at the embossed silver crest of Vanguard Digital Strategy and then looked back up at me. A profound, undeniable nod of professional respect crossed his hardened features. "This makes our job considerably easier, Ms. Sterling," he said, tucking the dossier securely under his arm. "We have been trying to untangle his offshore routing for weeks. Your firm handed us the map on a silver platter. Thank you for your cooperation." "I am always happy to assist federal authorities," I replied smoothly. As the investigator turned back to direct his team, my eyes drifted past him to the wreckage of my family. Richard was no longer yelling. The booming, aggressive patriarch who had demanded my submission for 35 years had completely deflated. He stumbled backward and slumped heavily into his dining chair. His mouth hung slightly open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. He was staring at the floor, but his eyes were completely vacant, unseeing. How was a broken, bankrupt man? The undeniable realization that he had traded his actual daughter for a parasitic lie had finally crushed him. He had blindly handed the keys to his entire financial existence to a charismatic fraud, and he had actively attacked the only person trying to warn him. He had lost his retirement. He had lost his estate. He had lost his status. And as he sat there staring into the abyss of his own monumental stupidity, he looked like an empty hollow shell. Uncle Thomas, Aunt Miriam, and Cousin Beatrice did not offer him a single word of comfort. The wealthy extended family, the people who had gathered to celebrate Greg's phantom buyout, moved with silent, urgent precision. They retrieved the coats from the backs of their chairs, their faces pale and set in lines of grim determination. They did not look at Richard. They completely ignored Beverly. They backed away from the ruined table, severing their ties instantly and permanently. When poverty and federal indictments enter the room, the wealthy scatter like roaches from a light. They abandoned Richard and Beverly to their self-made disaster without a second glance, leaving them entirely isolated in the center of the restaurant. "All right, get them out of here," the lead investigator barked, gesturing sharply toward the doors. The agents hauled Greg and Felicity to their feet. The perp walk began. It was a slow, agonizing march through the center of the dining room. Greg kept his head down, weeping loudly into his chest, trying desperately to hide his face from the flashing camera phones. Felicity, on the other hand, could not accept her reality. She thrashed against the agent's grip, screaming wildly at the patrons, telling them to stop recording, crying that her rights were being violated. Her ruined dress dragged against the marble, her heels slipping and sliding as she was forcefully marched out of the establishment. The heavy glass doors swung open and the cold, flashing red and blue lights swallowed them whole. I turned away from the spectacle, feeling completely unburdened. I walked calmly toward the coat check, retrieved my tailored trench coat, and slipped it on over my suit. I walked out of the restaurant, stepping past the remaining federal agents and moving toward the valet stand. The night air was freezing, slicing through the residual adrenaline, but I welcomed the chill. It felt like walking into a brand new existence. I handed my ticket to the valet, who was staring wide-eyed at the police cruisers blocking the lane. He quickly nodded and sprinted off to retrieve my car. Hazel. The scream was ragged, torn from a throat raw with hysteria. I did not turn around immediately. I stood perfectly still under the awning of the valet stand, listening to the frantic slapping of footsteps rushing across the wet pavement behind me. "Hazel, wait. You cannot leave." Beverly crashed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, sprinting out into the freezing rain without a coat. She was completely hysterical. The devastating shock of the last 10 minutes had entirely broken her mind. Her golden daughter was sitting in the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs. Her husband was catatonic in a dining chair. Her bank accounts were frozen, and her home was gone. She ran toward me, her arms outstretched, her face twisted into a mask of pure primal terror. She was realizing the true, unvarnished horror of her situation. She had spent decades worshipping status and wealth, and now she had absolutely nothing left. She was destitute, and the only person standing between her and the streets was the daughter she had deemed entirely worthless. "Hazel!" Beverly screamed, lunging toward the valet stand, the flashing police lights illuminating the absolute ruin of her perfect life. The freezing Seattle rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets, plastering my mother's expensive salon blowout flat against her skull. Beverly slipped on the wet pavement, her designer heels skidding wildly as she closed the final distance between us. She practically slammed into my side, her wet hands frantically gripping the sleeves of my immaculate trench coat. The flashing red and blue lights from the armada of police cruisers reflected in the puddles around our feet, casting her terrified face in a harsh, unforgiving neon glow. She looked absolutely wretched. The haughty, untouchable matriarch of the Sterling family was gone, entirely replaced by a shivering, panicked woman who had just watched her entire universe burn to the ground. "Hazel, you cannot leave me here!" Beverly screamed over the chaotic symphony of rain and police sirens. Her voice was shrill, grating, and completely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. You saw what they did to Greg. You saw what they did to your sister. They are going to take the house on Tuesday. They are going to lock the gates and throw our belongings onto the street. Your father is inside falling apart, and I have absolutely no idea what to do. I looked down at her hands gripping my coat. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply stood there under the protective canvas awning of the valet stand, allowing her to feel the full weight of my icy silence. You have to take us in! Beverly pleaded, her grip tightening as she shook my arm in a frantic rhythm. You live in that massive penthouse downtown. I know you do. Thomas told me about it months ago when you bought it. It has 4 bedrooms, Hazel. It is enormous. Your father and I can just move in with you. We will take the guest suites. You have the room. You have the money to support us while we figure out how to rebuild. You can hire lawyers for Felicity. You can fix this. Hazel, please, what are you going to do to save this family? The sheer, unadulterated delusion required to utter those words was staggering. After 35 years of relentless emotional abuse, after treating me like an embarrassing blemish on her perfect social record, after turning a blind eye while her golden child stole my identity and financed a fraudulent empire, she actually believed she was entitled to my sanctuary. She believed my home, the fortress I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears, was simply another asset for her to claim. She looked at my wealth and saw a life raft she was entirely entitled to board. But you are my daughter! Beverly sobbed, her voice cracking as the cold rain ran down her cheeks, mixing with her ruined makeup. We are still blood, Hazel. I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot turn your back on your own mother when she is standing on the edge of a cliff. Blood means you do not abandon your family. The word blood hung in the freezing air between us. It was the ultimate manipulation, the final desperate card in her entirely depleted deck. But the moment she played it, she triggered a memory so vivid and visceral that it momentarily completely silenced the noise of the sirens and the rain. I was transported back exactly 3 years. I was sitting on the crinkling paper of a cold examination table in a sterile, fluorescent-lit oncology clinic. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and impending doom. The oncologist, a kind woman with tired eyes, had just delivered the devastating news that the lump was malignant and that I would need aggressive, immediate chemotherapy to survive. The terror had swallowed me whole. I was 27 years old, facing the very real possibility of my own death, and my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the informational pamphlets the nurse had handed me. I had looked up desperately, seeking the comforting embrace of my mother. I needed her to hold me. I needed her to tell me that I was going to be all right, and that she would fight this battle by my side. Instead, Beverly was standing near the door, checking the diamond watch on her wrist, with an expression of profound irritation. She let out a long, exasperated sigh that echoed off the linoleum walls. She did not offer a hug. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply looked at me with a cold, dismissive shrug. She had adjusted her designer scarf, looked dead into my terrified eyes, and said she could not deal with my dramatic timing because she had to meet Felicity for a bridal luncheon at the country club. She had walked out of that clinic and left me entirely alone to face the darkest, most terrifying chapter of my life. The memory crystallized in my mind, burning away any microscopic trace of pity that might have lingered in my heart. I looked at the shivering, desperate woman standing before me in the rain and felt absolutely nothing. I slowly raised my hands and physically detached her fingers from my trench coat, peeling her grip away with deliberate, undeniable force. Beverly gasped, stumbling back a half step, her eyes widening in pure horror as she realized her final manipulation had completely failed. I adjusted my designer coat, pulling the collar tight against the chill of the damp night air. I stood perfectly straight, towering over her broken, trembling form. I looked dead into my mother's eyes, channeling the exact same cold, apathetic energy she had weaponized against me my entire life. I let the silence stretch for one agonizing second before I mirrored the exact same cold, dismissive shrug she had given me in that oncology clinic. I cannot deal with this right now, I said, my voice incredibly smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. I have a flight to catch. The absolute devastation that washed over Beverly's face was a masterpiece of karmic justice. Her jaw went completely slack, her mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. The realization struck her with the destructive force of a freight train. She remembered. I saw the exact moment the memory of the oncology clinic flashed behind her eyes, and I saw the horrifying understanding that she had sealed her own fate 3 years ago. Right on cue, a sleek jet-black town car pulled smoothly up to the valet stand, its tires hissing quietly against the wet pavement. The uniformed driver stepped out immediately, opening the heavy rear door with practiced professional efficiency. The warm leather-scented air of the luxurious interior spilled out into the freezing night, offering a sanctuary of absolute comfort and security. "No," Beverly wailed, her voice breaking into a guttural primal scream. "Hazel, no! You cannot do this! You cannot leave me!" I did not offer her a single backward glance. I stepped smoothly into the back of the town car, sinking into the plush heated leather seat. The driver shut the door with a solid, reassuring thud, instantly muting my mother's hysterical screams. The thick soundproof glass of the luxury vehicle severed the connection entirely, transforming Beverly from a terrifying monster into a pathetic muted figure waving her arms wildly in the rain. "Take me to the private terminal, please," I told the driver, my voice perfectly steady. "Right away, Ms. Sterling," he replied, slipping smoothly behind the wheel and putting the car into gear. The heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, gliding effortlessly past the chaotic scene at the restaurant. I looked out the tinted window, watching the flashing police lights fade into the distance. I saw the federal agents marching a handcuffed, sobbing Greg out the front doors. I saw Felicity screaming at a local news crew that had just arrived on the scene, her ruined dress dragging through the puddles. And I saw Beverly standing completely alone in the freezing rain, watching the taillights of my car disappear into the Seattle night. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for 3 decades finally evaporated. As the town car navigated the wet, glowing streets toward the airport, I pulled my phone from my bag. There was a message from the head of my legal team at Vanguard Digital Strategy. It was a single line confirming that the federal asset freeze on the Sterling and Vance accounts was absolute and permanent. The operation was a flawless, total success. I locked the screen and dropped the phone back into my bag, closing the door on my past forever. The transition at the private terminal was seamless and utterly devoid of stress. There were no lines, no chaotic crowds, and no frantic announcements. I was escorted directly through a discreet security checkpoint and walked out onto the rain-slicked tarmac where the massive gleaming aircraft awaited. Boarding the flight to Tokyo felt like stepping into an entirely new dimension of existence. The first-class suite was a marvel of modern luxury, an enclosed private sanctuary, crafted from polished wood, soft cream leather, and brushed gold accents. The cabin attendant, a polite smiling woman named Haruka, greeted me by name, taking my coat and offering me a warm scented towel. I settled into the wide, comfortable seat, pressing a button to slide the privacy doors completely shut. The subtle ambient lighting of the suite washed over me, creating a cocoon of absolute tranquility. Haruka returned a moment later, carrying a silver tray, holding a slender crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. I thanked her, accepting the glass and feeling the cool, delicate crystal against my fingertips. The powerful engines of the aircraft roared to life, a deep vibrating hum that signaled departure. As the plane taxied down the runway, ascending powerfully into the dark, rain-swept sky, I leaned back against the plush headrest. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, bright bubbles dance across my tongue. I looked down at my hands. They were strong, steady, and completely still. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, completely reveling in the effortless, painless expansion of my chest. I was vibrantly, unapologetically healthy. The cancer that my family had viewed as an annoying inconvenience was entirely gone, eradicated by my own sheer willpower and the medical care I had financed myself. The fragile, sickly girl who had begged for her mother's comfort in a sterile clinic no longer existed. In her place sat a titan of industry, a woman who had built an empire from the ashes of her own neglect. I looked out the small, oval window, watching the glittering grid of Seattle shrink into a tapestry of tiny, insignificant lights far below me. Down there in the rain, my family was facing the absolute ruin of their own making. They were bankrupt, facing federal indictments, and permanently stripped of the social status they had worshipped above all else. They had tried to consume me, and instead they had devoured themselves. I took another sip of champagne, turning my gaze away from the past and looking toward the endless dark horizon. I was flying toward Tokyo, toward a month of lavish, unapologetic indulgence. I was going to eat at the finest restaurants, sleep in the most luxurious suites, and explore a vibrant, beautiful city without a single toxic tether pulling me back. My wealth was entirely secured, locked behind ironclad corporate firewalls that my family could never breach. My health was vibrant and restored, a testament to my own unwavering resilience. But most importantly, as the plane leveled out above the clouds, banking gracefully toward the Pacific Ocean, I felt a profound, absolute stillness settle over my entire being. The chaotic, screaming ghosts of my family had finally been silenced. I was completely unburdened, totally untouchable, and for the first time in my entire life, my peace was absolute. The story of Hazel's ultimate triumph teaches us a profound and often difficult truth: sharing DNA with someone does not entitle them to your peace, your success, or your absolute loyalty. Society frequently conditions us to believe that family is everything, and that blood ties demand unconditional forgiveness and endless sacrifice. However, toxic relationships do not magically become healthy simply because you share a last name. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support in your darkest hours, and genuine care, not by manipulation, entitlement, and greed. When you are surrounded by people who view your struggles as an inconvenience and your success as their personal asset, the most empowering action you can take is to walk away. Setting an impenetrable boundary is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of essential self-preservation. Hazel's victory was not merely about securing her wealth or watching her abusers face federal consequences. Her true triumph was the complete reclamation of her self-worth. She learned that she did not have to set herself on fire to keep her toxic family warm. The ultimate revenge against those who try to destroy you is not to destroy them back, but to step aside, let them orchestrate their own inevitable downfall, and board a first-class flight to your own vibrant, unburdened future. Absolute peace is the ultimate luxury, and you must protect it at all costs. If you have ever had to draw a hard line with toxic people and choose your own peace, share your experiences in the comments below. If Hazel's journey to freedom resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your power.